Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Dr. Islam Monroe sat in the sterile glow of her lab, her eyes scanning the screens in front of her. The hum of machines, the rhythmic click of her keyboard, and the occasional rustling of papers were the only sounds that filled the room. She had become accustomed to the isolation. After all, it was the price of genius. The breakthroughs, the discoveries, the work that would forever change humanity, they didn't come to those who sought comfort. She wasn't sure how long she had been here, days perhaps. Time had begun to blur. But tonight was different. Tonight was special. "You're almost there," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse from days of little sleep and too many cups of coffee. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clicked through the final stages of her research. She'd been working on this for months. A new strain of bacteria designed to eliminate digestive disorders, boost gut health, and improve overall longevity. The theory was groundbreaking. If she succeeded, it would be one of the greatest medical advancements of the century. She hadn't told anyone. The science community would never understand. Not yet. They'd call it reckless. They'd call it dangerous. But Isla had always felt that her work wasn't for others. It was for something larger, something profound. The petri dish in front of her was filled with a swirling culture of the bacteria she'd painstakingly engineered. Isla had been adjusting the genetic structure of the microorganisms for weeks, trying to perfect them. She wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified of what she'd created. Each modification had pushed the boundaries of known science, each change making the bacteria more resilient, more powerful. But that came with a risk. She set the pipette aside, the liquid inside the container a glowing pale green. The strain had just begun to show its potential, but this was the moment of truth. Isla had reached the final phase of her experiment, testing it on herself. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the glowing concoction in the dish, then took a deep breath. The future of medicine, her legacy, rested on this very moment. She carefully poured the bacteria into a small vial, its glow faintly illuminating her fingers. Her reflection in the glass seemed hollow, gaunt. It had been days since she'd seen the sun, and her eyes were red from exhaustion. She shook her head, trying to dispel the lingering doubts that danced in her mind. "You've come too far, Isla. You've already done the impossible," she muttered under her breath. With a steady hand, she swallowed the contents of the vial. It was warm, tingling as it slid down her throat, and for a moment there was nothing, just the lingering taste of the sterile liquid. No immediate discomfort, no pain. She sat back, watching the petri dish, as if waiting for it to confirm that she had made the right decision. A few seconds passed, then a strange feeling washed over her. A sudden, intense hunger gripped her stomach. It was a sensation unlike anything she had ever felt, an insatiable, gnawing emptiness that went deeper than the pit of her stomach. She felt as though her insides were clawing at her, demanding more. She swallowed, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. Her mouth went dry, and she found herself staring at the leftover coffee on the counter. Without thinking, she grabbed the cup and drained it in one go, the bitter liquid burning her throat as it went down. But it wasn't enough. The hunger, no, the craving had only intensified. She moved toward the fridge, hands shaking, and pulled out everything she could find: half-eaten sandwiches, leftover pizza, even a carton of yogurt. She shoved it all into her mouth, barely tasting the food as she chewed. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Just a little more, she murmured to herself, eyes wild as she grabbed for more, her body urging her forward. The hunger was a living thing inside her, relentless. She couldn't stop. It was then that she noticed the first sign of something wrong. Her hands were trembling violently, and as she wiped her mouth, she felt something odd, a slight burning sensation on her skin. She glanced at her fingers, where the skin had begun to darken, a strange rash forming beneath the surface. "Is this normal?" she whispered, looking at her reflection in the fridge door. Her skin was pale, but the blotchy red patches that had appeared were spreading, crawling along her arms like something alive. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a reaction to the bacteria, it was something more, something darker, something she hadn't prepared for. Her heartbeat quickened, and her stomach churned with an back toward the desk, clutching the edge to steady herself. She needed to think. She needed to focus. The computer screen before her flickered, and a notification popped up, cellular growth rate increasing by 150%. Her eyes widened. The bacteria was adapting, evolving. She had hoped for improvement, but this was something else. The hunger within her flared again, and for the first time, Isla began to feel a sinking, undeniable terror. This wasn't an advancement in science. This was an infection. The bacteria had changed her. She pressed her hand to her stomach, but the ache only grew. "What have I done?" she whispered, the fear seizing her as she turned to the lab's emergency protocols. It was too late to reverse the process now, and she knew it. The bacteria was inside her, and it was hungry. Isla's hands trembled as she navigated through the lab's computer system, her mind racing. Her stomach twisted in knots, as though something inside her was stirring, fighting against her. The image of the glowing bacteria on the petri dish flashed in her mind, her creation, her responsibility, and now it was invading her, changing her from the inside out. She slammed her hand on the desk, willing the panic to stop. Focus, she told herself. She had to focus. Her rational mind had always been her strength, but now it felt like it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The rash on her skin spread further, covering the back of her hands. The feeling in her stomach grew stronger, aching, bloated. She staggered to the sink, running cold water over her wrists, hoping the chill would bring some clarity. But it only made the sensation worse. The hunger clawed at her insides with renewed force, pushing against her ribcage as though demanding to be fed. She needed to test her hypothesis. Her mind clung to the notion that there must be a logical explanation, a way to understand what was happening to her. But as the minutes passed, her thoughts became more jumbled, the hunger more demanding. She grabbed a notebook from the desk and scribbled frantically, her handwriting messy and erratic. Symptoms: increased hunger, skin discoloration, abnormal cellular growth. This isn't normal, she thought. I didn't account for this. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, insistent pain in her chest. It was as though something inside her was pressing, pushing outward, trying to escape. Her breath caught in her throat. She doubled over, clutching her abdomen, but the pain was only momentary, followed by a wave of nausea. A sweat broke out along her forehead, and she struggled to remain standing, her legs weak beneath her. She turned back to the sink and vomited. But what came up was not just food. It was dark, almost black, a thick, tar-like substance that splashed onto the porcelain. Her eyes widened in horror. The bile wasn't normal. The bacteria, the strange strain she had ingested, was inside her, and now it was making its presence known in the most brutal way possible. Shaking uncontrollably, Isla wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her reflection stared back at her from the sink, pale, sweaty, wide-eyed, and she barely recognized the person in the mirror. The dark patches of skin on her arms had spread, now forming twisted veins that pulsed faintly beneath her skin. She turned her hand over, her fingers trembling as she watched the veins wriggle like something alive beneath her flesh. Something had changed. Everything had changed. Her creation was taking over her body, and she wasn't prepared for this. Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots. She had studied bacteria and viruses her whole life, but this was unlike anything she had ever seen. She stumbled back to the desk, pulling open a drawer to retrieve her journal. Her hand hovered over the page as she tried to regain control of her thoughts, but the hunger gnawed at her again, more desperate now. It felt like something was clawing inside her stomach, growing inside her, feeding off of her. The door to the lab opened with a creak, and Isla froze. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Her heart pounded, and her breath hitched as she quickly wiped her mouth. She looked up, eyes darting toward the doorway. It was Tom, the lab assistant she'd briefly hired months ago. He was tall, with scruffy brown hair and a faint stubble that looked like it hadn't been touched in days. His eyes locked onto hers, and his expression faltered as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Isla," he said hesitantly, stepping inside. "I heard something. Are you okay?" Isla couldn't bring herself to speak. The hunger, the sickness, it all flooded her senses, too overwhelming for words. Tom had no idea what was happening to her, and she couldn't risk him finding out. "Not yet. I'm fine," she forced out, her voice raspy. Just a little tired. Go away, Tom." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You look like you're about to pass out. You're not fine. What happened?" Isla took a slow step back, her hands trembling at her sides. What should she say? How could she explain any of this to him? She had to act fast. She had to get rid of him. I just need to be alone. Please. It's nothing serious," she said, trying to steady her breathing. Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears, detached. Tom hesitated, still watching her with concern. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," Isla interrupted, her voice a little too sharp. "Please, Tom." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then he slowly nodded. "All right, but if you need anything, just let me know." Isla barely nodded in response, barely listening as he backed out of the room. She waited until the door clicked shut behind him before she collapsed into the nearest chair, gasping for breath. The hunger was consuming her, growing stronger by the second, and Isla realized with terrifying clarity that there was no turning back. Something was inside her, something she had created, and it was changing her. Her hands moved to her stomach once more, fingers pressing against the tightness growing within. Her body was betraying her. The bacteria was feeding, but feeding on what? On her. She needed to act fast. She needed a solution. But all she could think about was the insatiable hunger, gnawing at her insides, urging her forward. It would never stop. Isla's breath came in short gasps as she gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles turning white. She could feel the bacteria inside her, pulsing and shifting as if it were alive. Her insides churned, a mixture of hunger and agony that she couldn't control. It was as if she were being eaten alive from within, the hunger never satiated, the pain never easing. Her eyes darted around the lab, her thoughts scattered like broken glass. She had to figure out what to do. She had to stop this, but how? She couldn't just undo what she had done. The bacteria was already inside her, and it was evolving faster than she could keep up with. With a shaky hand, she reached for her phone and opened her research log. Her fingers slipped over the screen, and she struggled to focus on the data in front of her. But nothing made sense anymore. The numbers, the calculations, the diagrams, it was all wrong. The strain was supposed to enhance gut health, not consume the body. It was supposed to be a harmless improvement. But now, as her body twisted with pain, Isla realized with a sinking feeling that the strain had become something else entirely. It was no longer a tool for enhancement. It was a parasite, and she was its host. The sharp, gnawing pain in her stomach flared again. She gritted her teeth, trying to push it away, but it was like an unstoppable force. She couldn't hold back the instinctual need for more. She needed to feed this thing that was inside her. But there was no food in the lab, no way to satisfy it. She stumbled to her feet, her vision spinning as the room around her seemed to warp. She stumbled toward the door, her hand pressed against the wall for support, and made her way to the hallway. Just outside the lab. There's food, something to hold off the hunger. Just something to stop this for a moment. Isla's footsteps were unsteady as she moved down the hallway. The lights above her flickered, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She could barely focus on her surroundings. The only thing she could feel was the emptiness inside her, the hunger that was growing stronger with each passing second. She reached the break room and opened the fridge. The cold air hit her like a slap to the face, and for a moment, she simply stood there, frozen, staring at the shelves lined with food. She reached for the nearest thing, a half-eaten sandwich, and tore into it without thinking. But it didn't help. The hunger remained, even as she devoured everything in sight. Chips, a yogurt, leftover pizza. None of it was enough. None of it was satisfying the thing inside her. She dropped the empty containers onto the counter, a sense of dread settling over her. The pain in her body was escalating, and the patches on her skin were spreading faster now, crawling up her arms and across her neck like an invasive vine. She could feel something moving beneath her skin, growing. She glanced at her reflection in the window, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Her eyes were no longer the pale blue they had once been. They had become milky, almost clouded, and her pupils were dilated. Her skin had taken on a strange, sickly hue, and the veins in her neck were visible, dark and pulsating beneath the surface. The lines of her jaw had become more angular, more alien, and her lips were tight, pulled back as if stretched by something inside her. Isla's hand shot to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her as she tried to steady herself. No, this isn't me anymore. The realization hit her with the full force of a freight train. The bacteria had begun to reshape her. Not just her insides, but her body, her very appearance. She wasn't human anymore. She wasn't even a person. She stumbled back from the mirror, panic rising in her chest. What had she done? What had she created? The hunger surged again, and it was all she could do to hold herself together. She tried to push the thoughts of her appearance aside, but the feeling of her skin stretching, her body twisting under the strain of the bacteria, was too overwhelming. It was like her flesh was fighting to break free of its human form, and she was powerless to stop it. No more food, she thought desperately, trying to steady her breath. She couldn't feed this thing inside her anymore. It wasn't food that it wanted. It wasn't satisfaction. It was consumption. Isla's mind raced as the hunger gnawed at her. She needed to understand what was happening. She needed to fix this before it was too late. She rushed back to the lab, her mind scattered, her body trembling with a feverish energy. She needed to study the bacteria, find out what it had done, what it was doing to her. There had to be an answer. There had to be a way to reverse this. But as she sat down at her computer and started pulling up the research, her vision blurred. The screens in front of her seemed to flicker, the words becoming distorted, as if the bacteria was already influencing her mind, clouding her judgment, altering her thoughts. She shook her head, trying to stay focused. The hunger was still there, a ravenous, gnawing presence deep inside her. It was growing, spreading, consuming her. She was losing herself. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could try to slow the bacteria down, maybe inject herself with a counteragent or some kind of suppressant. But she knew, deep down, that nothing could stop it now. She had crossed the point of no return. And the bacteria, she realized with chilling clarity, wasn't just consuming her body. It was taking control. She gripped the edge of the desk as the lab around her seemed to warp. Her skin burned, her vision pulsed with dizziness, and her stomach twisted in agony. The hunger was relentless. In that moment, Isla understood. This wasn't just a biological experiment. This was a new life form, and it was only just beginning. Her breath quickened, her fingers trembling as they typed the last words she would write before the bacteria completely overtook her. Containment failure. Subject is lost. The lab was eerily quiet, the only sound the rapid thudding of Isla's heart. Her vision blurred again, the words on the screen shifting and warping as though the very fabric of her reality was beginning to crumble. She had no control over her body anymore, only the overwhelming, gnawing hunger that consumed every thought, every cell of her being. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but all she could do was sit there, her mind a haze of fractured thoughts as her body shifted in ways she couldn't understand. The bacteria inside her was in control now. It was rewriting her, rewriting everything she knew. Her fingers twitched, her eyes twitching toward the wall where her reflection stared back at her, half-formed and grotesque. But her mind was no longer her own. The hunger surged again, like a violent wave crashing over her, pulling her back into the dark, desperate abyss. It was then that the door to the lab creaked open again. Isla barely heard it over the thundering pulse in her ears, but the sudden rush of movement caught her attention. Tom stepped cautiously into the room, his expression tense as he glanced at Isla's hunched form, the grotesque changes now visible. His eyes widened, scanning her from head to toe. Isla, Tom's voice was soft, unsure. Are you? Okay. Isla didn't move at first. She couldn't. The bacteria, the thing inside her, was fighting against her every instinct. But she needed to feed, and the presence of another person, of fresh meat, made her skin crawl with desperation. No, she thought desperately, stay in control. But the hunger had a will of its own, and it screamed louder than any thought. Without thinking, she stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and turned toward Tom. Her movements were jerky, inhuman, her hands twitching as if trying to grab him, pull him in. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It was the bacteria's. It was a monstrous thing that had overtaken her, and Tom didn't realize the danger. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. What happened to you? Isla, your skin. But his voice trailed off as Isla moved forward again, faster this time. Her body was too fast for her mind to control, her arms shooting out, fingers extending like claws. The hunger, the need, drove her forward, and before she could stop herself, she grabbed Tom's shoulder, dragging him close to her. Tom let out a strangled shout, trying to break free, but Isla's grip was too strong, too unnatural. Her eyes locked onto his with a terrifying intensity. His fear was palpable, and it only made her more ravenous. Isla, no, he gasped, his voice shaking. He grabbed at her wrist, but she could feel the power in her body. Something inside her had taken over, something far stronger than she'd ever been. She was no longer just a human, but a creature born from her own creation. She could hear his heartbeat, his breath, his fear, and she wanted it. She needed it. Her mouth, which had once been human, was now twisted, her teeth sharpened and elongated, her gums pulling tight. She could feel the saliva pooling in her mouth, her teeth itching to sink into his flesh. Feed, her body urged. Consume. With a guttural growl, Isla pulled Tom closer, her mouth opening wide. But before she could sink her teeth into him, something inside her stopped. She froze, the hunger still there, still screaming for release. But for just a moment, Isla had control again. She gasped, shaking her head, trying to clear the fog from her mind. Isla, what the hell is happening to you? Tom pleaded, his voice trembling. Isla's eyes flicked between him and the lab door. She had to do something. She couldn't let this go any further. The bacteria was inside her, yes, but it was also inside her mind. Her every thought was clouded by its presence. It was driving her insane with hunger. I can't stop it, she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't stop what I've done. Tom looked at her with confusion, horror in his eyes. You're not yourself. You need help, Isla. This isn't you. This is... Before he could finish, Isla's body lurched forward again, unable to resist. She felt the hunger clawing at her throat, at her chest, at her very soul. She could feel the bacteria pushing her forward, urging her to take him. And she couldn't fight it any longer. Her hands reached for him, her nails like talons, and she pulled. Tom screamed, trying to break free, but he wasn't fast enough. She sank her teeth into his shoulder, the raw, metallic taste of blood flooding her senses. The first bite was euphoric, a release like nothing she had ever felt, and she tore in him again, a vicious, primal hunger that left no room for reason, for remorse. And as the life began to drain from Tom, as his body went limp in her arms, Isla's mind fought back. No, but the bacteria would not let go. The hunger would not let go. Isla stumbled back, wiping the blood from her lips, staring down at Tom's lifeless body. Her heart pounded, but there was no satisfaction in what she had done. The hunger wasn't gone. It would never be gone. The bacteria would never stop feeding on her. She looked at her hands, the blood staining her fingers, her skin still rippling beneath her as though the bacteria was shifting, growing, transforming her into something she could no longer recognize. Her reflection in the glass was a grotesque mockery of who she had once been. Her face, now gaunt, was stretched, her features distorted. Her skin had taken on a grayish hue, and the veins beneath it pulsed with dark life, moving with a sickly rhythm. The transformation was complete, and all she could think about now was the hunger, the need to feed. And as the room around her spun, Isla realized, with cold clarity, that there was no going back. She had become the thing she had feared. The hunger had won. The lab felt suffocating, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood that clung to Isla's skin. Her heart raced in her chest, but it felt distant, like it was no longer fully hers. The hunger was louder than ever, gnawing away at her insides, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Every thought, every shred of her former self was drowning under the weight of it. She glanced down at Tom's body, his eyes staring up at her with shock and fear. Her stomach lurched, the realization of what she had done crashing over her like a tidal wave. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to hurt him, but she couldn't control it. The bacteria inside her had made her into something else entirely. Her body trembled, as though it was fighting against the transformation, fighting against the mindless drive to feed. But she couldn't stop. She could feel it deep in her core. The bacteria was alive in her, and it wanted more. It always wanted more. With a strangled cry, Isla turned away from Tom's body, staggering toward the door. She had to get out. She had to get away from the lab, from everything that had become her. She needed space, time to think, time to understand what had happened. Her hand shook as she grasped the doorknob, the cold metal pressing into her palm. She twisted it, but before she could open the door, she heard it. The sound of footsteps, heavy and fast, approaching from down the hallway. Isla froze. She felt the hunger stirring again, like an animal waking from slumber. No, she couldn't, not again. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed herself against the wall, her back to the door, trying to steady her breathing. But the hunger was relentless. The need to feed was like a beast inside her clawing at her insides. Her skin burned, and her senses sharpened to an inhuman level. She could smell the sweat of the approaching figure, the faint hint of fear on the air. It was like she could feel the blood pulsing beneath their skin. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Her body tensed, her muscles screaming with a need that she couldn't ignore. And then the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Lena, the lab's head researcher and Isla's mentor. The look of surprise quickly shifted to concern as she took in Isla's appearance. Isla, Lena's voice was calm, but there was an edge of fear to it. What happened to you? Isla's eyes met hers, but all she could think about was the scent of Lena's blood, the warmth radiating off her body. She could feel the bacteria shifting within her, urging her to act. It was too much, too powerful. She was losing herself to it, slipping further and further into the monster she'd become. Lena took a step forward, her brow furrowing. Isla, you're sick. You need help. Whatever happened, whatever you've done to yourself, it's not too late to fix it. We can figure this out. Isla's hand twitched. She knew Lena's voice. She trusted her, but there was nothing she could do anymore. The bacteria inside her wasn't just transforming her body, it was rewriting her very nature. She wasn't Isla anymore. She was something else, something other. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. Instead, a low growl escaped her throat, a guttural, inhuman sound. Lena paused, a slight frown tugging at the corners of her mouth. Isla, please, fight it. Whatever this is, we can still. But before Lena could finish, Isla was on her, faster than she had ever moved in her life. She didn't think. She didn't even want to think. Her body moved on instinct, her hands reaching out to grab Lena, to pull her closer, to feed on her. Lena gasped, pushing against Isla's chest, but it was no use. Isla's strength was unnatural, and as Lena struggled, her fear only made the hunger grow stronger. Isla could hear her heartbeat, feel the blood pumping through her veins. Feed. Consume. Isla's mind screamed. She didn't want this. She didn't want to hurt Lena. But the bacteria had a mind of its own, and it would not let her go. It wouldn't let her think, wouldn't let her stop. Lena cried out, her hands pushing against Isla's shoulders, trying to break free. But Isla was beyond reasoning now. The hunger was too powerful, too insatiable. She grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her in. There was no stopping it. She sank her teeth into Lena's neck, the flesh giving way easily as if it were nothing more than tissue paper. The taste was electrifying, like every ounce of her body was coming alive again. She could feel the warmth of Lena's blood flooding into her mouth, the rush of euphoria coursing through her veins. For a moment, it was all-consuming. The hunger ebbed, and Isla felt a fleeting moment of clarity, of humanity. But it was short-lived. The bacteria inside her screamed for more, urging her to drain every last drop, to take everything. She could feel Lena's body weakening, her heartbeat slowing. But Isla couldn't stop herself. The bacteria had taken over. There was no turning back. Lena's strength faltered, her body slumping in Isla's arms, but Isla barely noticed. She was too lost in the euphoria of feeding, too deep in the grip of the bacteria that was controlling her. Finally, Lena's body went still. Her pulse ceased, and the last trace of life drained away. Isla pulled back, her breath ragged, her body trembling. She stared down at Lena's lifeless form, the blood staining her hands. Her chest heaved as the hunger surged again, but this time she could feel it. Feel the bacteria, the thing inside her, grow stronger. It was feeding on the blood. It was growing. With shaking hands, Isla wiped her mouth and stepped back, her legs weak beneath her. Her mind swirled, a mix of horror and regret. But it was too late now. The bacteria was in control. Isla turned away from Lena's body, her mind a haze of desperation and panic. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in the lab, not with what she had done. Where can I go? What can I do? Her vision swam, the walls closing in. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her, feeding on her. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't stop herself. She had to get away. With one final look at the lab, Isla stumbled toward the door, her body swaying. There was no future for her here. The only thing left was the bacteria and the hunger that would never end. And as she stepped into the hallway, she realized that there was no escape. She was the monster now. Isla's legs wobbled beneath her, her vision still swimming from the intensity of what had just transpired. The blood on her hands felt hot, sticky, and raw. She could feel it, the gnawing hunger gnashing away at her insides, her entire body thrumming with the bacteria's power. Every step she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into something unnatural, something irreversible. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The silence in the building was overwhelming, deafening in its stillness. She could hear her own breath, ragged and desperate, as she stumbled down the corridor, searching for some kind of escape. Where'd she go? The hospital? The police? But even as she thought it, she knew it was pointless. The bacteria inside her had already gone too far. She could feel it crawling beneath her skin, weaving through her veins, mutating her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. It was consuming her in ways she couldn't stop, in ways that would spread beyond her, beyond anything she could control. And hunger? It was still there, constant. The need for more, for blood, for life. She reached the stairwell, leaned against the railing for support, her fingers digging into the cold metal as she tried to steady herself. The cool air felt like a foreign comfort against her feverish skin, but it didn't do enough. Nothing did. The hunger was like a beast inside her, and it wouldn't stop until it had devoured everything. Suddenly, there was a sound from behind her, a voice. Isla, she whipped around, her breath catching in her throat, her heart slamming against her ribs. Standing in the doorway to the stairwell was a figure she hadn't expected to see, Ryan, the security guard. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but there was fear in his eyes as they locked onto her. Isla's pulse spiked. No, not him. Anyone but him. She could smell his scent, the faint trace of sweat and anxiety clinging to him. And beneath that, his blood. It was like a call she couldn't ignore, a siren song that beckoned her forward. Ryan took a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his voice calm but quivering. Isla, I don't know what's happening, but you need to stop. You're scaring me. Isla's breath quickened, her body trembling with an uncontrollable urge. The hunger raked at her insides. Her eyes flashed as her teeth began to ache, her body tensing as it tried to fight the urge. She wanted to scream at him to stay away, to leave her alone, but she couldn't. She couldn't do anything. The bacteria was in control now. She stepped back, her mind fogging over, and Ryan, sensing the change in her, took a cautious step forward. Come on, Isla. We'll get help. We'll figure this out. Just stay with me, all right? His voice, the concern in it, felt like a distant memory, a cruel reminder of who she had once been. But that version of her was gone. Isla was gone. Without warning, she lunged at him. The hunger surged like a tidal wave, drowning everything in its path. Her teeth sank into his throat before he could even react, the warmth of his blood flooding her senses. She could feel him struggle for a moment, his hands pushing weakly against her, but it didn't matter. She could feel his life slipping away as the bacteria inside her reveled in the fresh source of sustenance. Ryan's body grew limp in her arms as she drained him, his blood staining her clothes, her skin, and her hands. The world around her was a blur of sound, but all she could focus on was the blood, the power, the satisfaction that spread through her veins. But once again, it was fleeting. It never lasted. As soon as she had taken what she needed, the hunger came rushing back, more insistent than before. The bacteria inside her was feeding, and it wasn't done. Isla pulled away from his body, staring down at the lifeless form of Ryan. Her chest heaved, her breath shallow and rapid. Her hands trembled, her mind swimming in the aftermath of what she had just done. She could feel the blood pooling beneath her, sticky and wrong. What have I become? She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her body shaking with revulsion. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to hurt him. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. But the hunger, the bacteria, it had taken everything from her. It controlled her now, and the more she fed, the more she lost herself. A noise from deeper within the building snapped her back to reality. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Isla didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to run. Her body, her mind, they were both lost. She could feel the transformation taking place beneath her skin, her body adapting to the needs of the bacteria, and there was no going back. The footsteps grew louder, and Isla looked around, panic setting in. There was nowhere to go. The building was locked down, the exit sealed. She was trapped. She turned, her eyes scanning for an escape, for anything that could give her even a moment of relief. She saw a narrow door off to the side. one that led to the back alley. It was her only option. With a final, desperate glance at Ryan's body, Isla ran. Her legs felt heavy, her mind too disjointed to process anything beyond the hunger that had taken root in her. She burst through the door into the alley, her breathing ragged. The cool night air hit her like a slap in the face, but did nothing to quell the storm inside her. She stumbled forward, her hands still covered in blood. The alley seemed endless, like a maze that she couldn't navigate. She could hear her heartbeat echoing in her ears, hear the blood rushing through her veins. The hunger was growing, becoming all-consuming. There was no way out, and she realized, in that moment, the truth she had been trying to avoid. She wasn't just running from the building. She was running from herself. Isla's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled deeper into the alley, the shadows swallowing her whole. The cool night air, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant traffic, barely registered in her foggy mind. Every step felt like it was pushing her further into the darkness, both physically and mentally. She could feel the bacteria writhing inside her, a vile, alien presence that thrummed in sync with her own pulse. It was like it was feeding off her fear, her panic, amplifying the hunger with every passing second. Her breath was ragged, the taste of Ryan's blood still fresh on her tongue, and yet it wasn't enough. The hunger never went away. It didn't just want to feed, it wanted to consume. Isla's vision flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving in the corner of her eye, shadows, or maybe figures, watching her. But when she turned, there was nothing. Only the alley, dark and silent, stretching on endlessly. She gasped for breath, her legs weak, the familiar ache of her transformation making every movement feel like a burden. Her fingers twitched at her sides, instinctively reaching for her face, her neck, feeling for any sign of the changes that were happening under her skin. Was she even human anymore? A sound snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was following her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she whipped around, but the alley was empty. She could see nothing but the shadows. She wasn't alone. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs betrayed her. They felt like they were made of lead. The hunger swelled inside her again, sharper, colder, like it was trying to break free. She could feel her teeth elongating, her senses heightening, every breath filled with the scent of blood, of life, of flesh. No, don't do this. Don't hurt anyone else. But the bacteria's grip was unrelenting. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, could feel it pulsing, vibrating in her veins. She couldn't think. She couldn't stop herself. The hunger pushed forward like a tidal wave, and Isla knew with terrible clarity that soon she would lose control. Another sound, a voice low and melodic, floating in from the darkness ahead. Isla, you don't have to keep running. Her breath caught. The voice was familiar, but distorted, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. She staggered back a few steps, feeling a sense of dread curling deep within her chest. She knew who it was. She had to know. The shadows in front of her seemed to stretch and twist, and slowly, a figure stepped forward. Tall, dark-haired, and wearing a lab coat, Dr. Callum, the lead scientist from the research facility. His face was pale, his eyes wide with what appeared to be both sympathy and something darker. Something predatory. Isla's stomach lurched. You. She could barely force the words past the tightening in her throat. How did you? I've been following your progress. Isla, Dr. Callum said, his voice smooth, almost gentle. I know what you become, what you will become. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing, studying her every movement with a strange intensity. But you don't have to face this alone. You don't have to fight the hunger anymore. The way he said it sent a chill crawling down her spine. His words were honeyed, and yet Isla could sense something terribly wrong beneath them. You don't understand. Her voice shook as she backed up, her hands gripping the walls of the alley for support. I'm not the same. I'm not me anymore. can't, her breath hitched. The hunger clawed at her throat, and her eyes locked onto his neck, drawn to the warmth of his blood, his pulse. Dr. Callum didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her stomach twist with dread. "I do understand, Isla. I've been there, too," he said softly, his voice almost soothing now. "The hunger, it never goes away, but you don't have to be afraid of it. It's power, Isla. True power. All that's required is to embrace it." Her body reacted before she even had time to think. The hunger surged within her, and before she could stop herself, she lunged toward him. But as her fingers brushed the edge of his coat, something strange happened. She froze. The hunger was still there, still clawing at her insides, but it was as if something about Callum's presence made it. Still, like a pressure had been released. She stepped back, her breath coming in ragged bursts as her senses reeled. You're not afraid." Callum's smile never wavered. "I've seen this before. I've helped others just like you. I'm the one who's been guiding the research. You're just another subject to me, Isla." His gaze was cold now, clinical. "But you don't need to be alone in this anymore. We can help you control it. Together, we can unlock the full potential of what you become." Isla's mind raced. His words made sense in a way. Control. Power. She could feel the bacteria inside her, growing stronger, its grip tightening. What if he was right? What if she could embrace it? Maybe then, the hunger would be satisfied. But something inside her screamed that it was wrong. This wasn't the solution. She wasn't just some experiment, some tool for someone else's ambitions. "No," she whispered the word to herself more than to him, her chest tightening as the truth hit her. "I'm not your experiment. I won't be." Dr. Callum's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing with irritation. "You can't run from it forever, Isla. You need me. You need the research. You're too far gone." Before Isla could react, a sharp pain shot through her head. The hunger. It was screaming inside her, louder than ever. Her vision blurred, and she could feel herself teetering on the edge of control. But one thing was clear. She had a choice to make. She couldn't trust him. Not Dr. Callum. Not anyone. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Isla pushed past him, running deeper into the alley, the cold air rushing past her like a hurricane. She could feel Dr. Callum's gaze on her, but she didn't stop. Not this time. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how long she could run. But for the first time since the infection had taken hold, Isla felt something like hope, a small, fragile spark. Maybe she could still fight this. Maybe she could still stop it. She just had to survive long enough to find out. Isla's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted through the alley, her feet pounding against the cold concrete, the echo of Dr. Callum's voice still ringing in her ears. His words had unsettled her, had tried to pull her into his twisted vision, but she wouldn't be a part of his plan. The hunger still gnawed at her insides, but something inside her was starting to fight back. Her thoughts were clouded, fragmented, but there was one thing she knew with certainty. She needed to get away from him. The alley stretched before her, winding and narrow, like a maze she couldn't escape. Her legs were starting to feel heavy, the strain of running through the night taking its toll on her. She had no clear destination. Her only focus was the adrenaline surging through her body and the desperate need to outrun the dark part of herself, the part that had taken root with the infection. You can still fight this. The thought was barely a whisper in her mind, but it was enough to drive her forward. She couldn't let it take over. She couldn't let herself become a monster. A flash of movement to her left caught her eye, something small darting into the shadows. Isla froze, her muscles tensing as she strained to see in the dim light. Was it another figure? Another person? Or had her senses become so heightened by the bacteria that her mind was playing tricks on her? The alley was empty, save for a scattering of garbage and the faint hum of distant traffic. She took a tentative step forward, her heartbeat steadying for the moment, but she didn't let her guard down. A faint sound, like a muffled cough, came from the shadows. Isla's breath hitched. Someone was there. "Hello," she called out hesitantly, her voice rough from the strain of her earlier exertion. "Is someone there?" For a moment, nothing. Then, a figure slowly emerged from the darkness, a young woman, no older than Isla herself. She was gaunt, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were alert, sharp, as though she'd been waiting for something. "Are you?" Isla began, unsure whether to approach or run. The woman didn't answer immediately. She merely took a step closer, her gaze scanning Isla's face. There was something about the woman, an intensity to her stare that made Isla feel both cautious and oddly comforted. "You're infected," the woman said flatly, as though it were a simple observation. Isla's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't told this stranger anything. How could she have known? "I know what you're going through," the woman continued, her voice soft but firm. "You're not alone in this." Isla's eyes narrowed, wariness creeping into her. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The woman stepped into the light fully, revealing her worn, tattered clothes. She looked like someone who had been living in the shadows for far too long. Her skin was almost translucent, as though she hadn't seen sunlight in months. But her presence was commanding, like she had endured what Isla was going through and emerged on the other side. "My name is Lena," the woman replied, her tone steady. "And I'm not just another infected. I'm one of the first. The original subjects, if you want to call us that." Lena paused for a moment, her eyes scanning Isla's face as if gauging her reaction. Then she continued, "You don't have to do this alone. We can fight back. We can end this." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Isla's mind was a whirlwind, struggling to process what Lena was saying. "And this? Fight back? You're one of them?" Isla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I was part of the original trials before they started altering the bacteria. They wanted us to become weapons. But something went wrong. We evolved, and now we have a choice." Isla's thoughts were a jumble of confusion and disbelief. She hadn't known there were others, hadn't known that anyone else had survived the transformation. The idea that she wasn't the only one dealing with the insatiable hunger. It was a relief, but it was also terrifying. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. "You're telling me we can control this?" Isla asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Lena gave a small, grim smile. "Control it? You're not listening. You can embrace it. You're stronger than you think, Isla, stronger than you realize. I've lived with this for years. I've learned how to manage it, how to use it." Isla took a step back, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "You're not telling me the truth. I'm not some monster." Lena's expression softened. "I'm not saying you're a monster. You're a survivor, Isla. You can learn to live with it. But you have to let go of the fear. Let go of the old version of yourself." Isla's chest tightened. The words felt like they were pulling her in two different directions. On one hand, Lena was offering a way out, some semblance of control over this terrifying transformation. But on the other hand, it felt wrong. The hunger, the bacteria, it was consuming everything she was. How could she live with something so unnatural? "I don't know if I can." Isla's voice trailed off, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. Lena took a step forward, her eyes gleaming with something like pity. "You don't have to do it alone. We're building a community. Others like us, survivors who have learned how to coexist with the infection. There's strength in numbers." The silence stretched between them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Isla hesitated. She had always been alone in this, had thought she was the only one. But now, the offer of a community, people who understood, felt like a lifeline. But could she trust Lena? Was this just another trap? Another attempt to control her? "I don't know," Isla said finally, her voice raw. "I don't know if I can trust you." Lena smiled, though it was a sad, knowing smile. "I understand, but you're running out of time, Isla. The hunger doesn't stop. It never will. You need to decide which path you're going to take. Embrace what you become. or fight a losing battle. Isla stood there, staring at the woman before her, her body trembling with indecision. The hunger burned inside her, relentless and cruel. What would she do? Would she fight, or would she give in? Isla stood in the dim light of the alley, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Lena's words echoed in her head, sharp and insistent, pulling at her from all sides. Embrace it, Lena had said. Let go of the old version of yourself. The hunger inside Isla clawed at her insides, an ever-present gnawing that had only grown stronger since the infection first took root. The bloodlust was a constant, demanding force. But the idea of losing herself completely, of becoming something unrecognizable, was terrifying. Lena's piercing gaze never wavered. She was waiting for Isla to make her decision, as if she already knew what would happen next. As if she knew Isla was on the verge of giving in. "You're not alone," Lena repeated, her voice low and comforting, yet chilling. "We can make it work. We can help you control the hunger. You can stop running." Isla's fingers twitched, her body betraying her as the craving swelled again, a powerful, visceral pull toward Lena's neck. The scent of blood, the taste of Ryan's life still lingering on her tongue, seemed to sharpen in the air. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, tried to ground herself to resist. Control. Her mind was screaming for release, but she knew, deep down, that giving in to the hunger meant losing everything. The bacteria inside her was powerful, yes, but it didn't define who she was. Or at least, it shouldn't. But the thought of living like this, always running, always hiding, could she survive it? Could she really fight it? What if I don't want to embrace it? Isla whispered, her voice trembling. What if I don't want to be like you? Lena stepped closer, her gaze softening, though there was an unspoken warning behind her words. "I know it's hard. I know you want to hold on to who you were. But that's the lie they want you to believe. The infection doesn't change you. It reveals who you really are. You just have to accept it." A sharp pain shot through Isla's chest. She could feel the bacteria growing inside her, could sense the way it was pushing her, urging her to give in. It felt like a split in her very being. Part of her wanted to listen to Lena, to stop fighting and accept the monstrous power that was coursing through her veins. But another part, the part that was still human, wanted to resist, to hold on to whatever was left of the person she had been. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows of the alley loomed over her, as if they were closing in, trapping her. The city felt like a distant memory now, a place she no longer belonged to. Lena didn't follow her, but her eyes never left Isla. "I'm not asking you to lose yourself," she said, her tone firm but kind. "I'm asking you to accept that survival means adaptation. You're stronger than you realize. Isla, you don't have to fight the infection. You can use it." Isla's hands trembled at her sides. She could feel the rage boiling beneath her skin. The need to lash out, to hurt, to consume. It wasn't just a craving. It was a compulsion, a force she couldn't control. She wanted to scream, to tear at her own skin, but she kept herself still, forced herself to breathe. "You're wrong," Isla said quietly, though her voice was heavy with doubt. "I don't want this. I don't want to be like you. I don't want to lose myself to the hunger." Lena sighed, a deep, almost wistful sound. She stepped back, lowering her eyes. "I was the same once. I thought I could fight it. I thought I could stay human. But in the end, Isla, you'll realize that you have no choice. You'll either give in to the hunger and become what you're meant to be, or you'll keep running, and it will destroy you." The weight of those words sank into Isla's bones. She could feel the truth in them, a hard, bitter reality she couldn't deny. The hunger was consuming her already. Every second spent fighting it felt like a battle lost. It was pulling her towards something she didn't understand, towards something terrifying. And yet, something about Lena's calm, steady presence, her promise of control, was like a lure. Isla closed her eyes, her hands shaking, her mind torn in two. What was the point of running? What if embracing the infection was the only way to survive? Is that what you've done? Isla asked, her voice hollow. You've just embraced it. Lena's eyes flickered, her expression hardening. For a moment, she looked almost sad, but then her face smoothed into something unreadable. Surviving means making hard choices, she said softly. There's no going back once you've crossed this line. The wind stirred in the alley, rustling the garbage and sending a chill through the air. Isla felt it on her skin, like a reminder of the world outside, of everything she had once known. But she was standing at the edge now, on the precipice of something unknown. She could feel it, a powerful force deep within her, waiting to break free. What if Lena was right? What if fighting it only made it worse? Isla's vision blurred, the world spinning as the hunger surged again, pushing her forward, demanding action. Her mouth went dry, her body trembling from the inside out. Lena, she whispered, her voice catching. What do I do? Lena's eyes softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of understanding passing through them. She stepped forward, reaching out to touch Isla's shoulder gently. You don't have to do this alone, she said, her voice low and coaxing. There's a place for you, a place where you can learn to live with this, a place where we can teach you how to control it. Isla's mind reeled, the hunger inside her clawing at her. She felt herself teetering on the edge, not knowing which way to fall. Lena's grip tightened slightly, as if sensing the indecision in Isla. Come with me. You can still make a choice. But if you wait much longer, it will be made for you. Isla's eyes narrowed, her fists clenched at her sides. She felt the weight of her decision bearing down on her, pressing on her chest. She could feel the bacteria in her veins, urging her to give in, to take the next step. She glanced up at Lena, her mind racing. The hunger was there, raw and insatiable. But was she strong enough to resist? The alley stretched out before her, dark and endless. And as she took a deep breath, Isla realized one thing. Her choice wasn't just about survival. It was about who she would become. Isla's heart raced as she stared at Lena, the weight of a decision pressing down on her chest like a vice. The hunger was there, gnawing at her, but something else, something far more primal, was fighting back. Her instincts screamed at her to reject the idea of becoming what? Lena had. To fight, to preserve whatever sliver of humanity she still had left. But the more she resisted, the more the hunger seemed to claw and demand to be fed. I don't know if I can trust you, Islam murmured, her voice trembling. Lena's expression softened, her eyes dark with understanding. I know it's hard, but if you keep running, if you keep hiding from what you've become, it'll destroy you. You'll lose everything. Your mind, your body, everything. The words hit Isla like a punch to the gut. She knew it was true. She could already feel the way the infection was taking hold of her mind, clouding her judgment, distorting her reality. The hunger wasn't just a physical thing anymore. It was inside her head, a constant whisperer, a voice that was growing louder with each passing moment. It was only a matter of time before she lost control completely. And yet, part of her wanted to fight. Part of her wanted to believe that there was still a chance for her to stay human, to find a way to stop this madness. She shook her head, her thoughts spinning. How do you know what I'm going through? How do you know what this feels like? Lena's face hardened for a moment, and for the first time, Isla saw something other than calm and control in her eyes. It was pain, a flicker of the torment she had gone through herself. Because I've lived it, Lena said quietly, her voice soft but laced with bitterness. I've been where you are. I was just like you, fighting, running, desperate to hold on to what I thought was normal. But in the end, there's only one truth. You can't escape it. You can't outrun the infection. You can only survive it. Isla's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of fear and frustration rising in her chest. She didn't want to accept that. She didn't want to believe that she was already too far gone. But Lena's words rang in her ears, cutting through the denial. Survival means adaptation. Isla closed her eyes for a moment, tried to silence the overwhelming surge of thought. Like a living thing, pulling her toward the dark, twisted path Lena had walked. It would be so easy to give in, to embrace the power, to stop running, to let the infection consume her. She could feel the call of it in her bones. But then a memory flashed in her mind. A memory of Ryan. His face, his laugh, the way he'd looked at her with hope. A memory of her own humanity before all of this started. Could she really throw all of that away? Please, Isla whispered, her voice breaking. I don't want to be like you. Lena's face softened once again, a quiet sadness creeping into her eyes. She reached out, as if to comfort Isla, but stopped herself just short of touching her. I'm not asking you to be like me, Lena said gently. I'm asking you to accept that you're not the person you were before. The infection is a part of you now, just as much as your heart beats in your chest. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll stop fighting a losing battle. Isla took a step back, her hands trembling at her sides. The hunger flared again, hotter, sharper this time. She could feel it in her veins, urging her to give in, to feed. Her mouth watered, her vision sharpening as the world around her seemed to grow more vivid, more dangerous. A voice echoed in her head, Ryan's voice, faint but clear. Don't let it take you. Don't let it win. She pressed a hand to her forehead, the throbbing pain intensifying. Her head felt like it might split open. The temptation to give in was overwhelming. But beneath the roar of hunger, beneath the feverish pull, Isla heard something else. The memory of who she was. The person she used to be. Could she fight it? Could she reclaim what she had lost? Lena watched her carefully, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, she sighed, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. You don't have to decide right now, Lena said, her tone almost soft. But the longer you wait, the harder it will be. This isn't something you can keep running from forever, Isla. The hunger will find you, and it will take everything. Isla's pulse raced as she looked at Lena. That was the truth, wasn't it? She had already lost so much. How much more could she afford to lose? I can't, Isla whispered, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. I can't just give in. Lena's expression darkened, a flash of something hard in her eyes. Then you'll keep running. You'll keep fighting a war you can't win. Isla felt herself being drawn to the brink again, the hunger twisting inside her like a live wire. It was too much, too strong. She could feel it consuming her, filling her thoughts, drowning out everything else. The urge to destroy, to feed, was overwhelming. And yet, as the hunger roared louder in her mind, Isla forced herself to focus. Forced herself to remember what it meant to be human. I will fight it, she said, her voice low but steady. I'll find a way. Lena studied her for a long moment, and for the first time, Isla saw something like regret flash across her face. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Then I'll leave you to your fight, Lena said, her voice clipped. But know this, Isla, the hunger never stops. Not until it's consumed everything. With one last look, Lena turned and disappeared into the shadows, her figure vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Isla stood there, alone again in the cold, quiet alley, the hunger pulsing through her veins like a living thing. It clawed at her, pushing her to give in, to let go, to stop resisting. But as the seconds ticked by, Isla made a choice. She wasn't ready to let go of who she was. She wasn't ready to become whatever Lena had become. She would find a way to fight. Somehow, some way. She had to. Isla stood in the alley, the cold air biting at her skin as the echo of Lena's words lingered in the darkness. She felt a burning fire deep within her, the hunger gnawing and demanding. But there was something else, a flicker of something stronger, a whisper of resistance. The moment Lena had disappeared into the shadows, Isla's resolve had hardened. She wouldn't let the infection take over. She couldn't. There had to be another way, another path that didn't lead her into the abyss. She could still hear the pounding of her own heart in her ears, the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. But with every breath she took, the fire inside her only burned brighter. I can fight this. Isla clenched her fists at her sides, the nails digging into her palms. The hunger had been with her for days, and each passing moment made it harder to ignore. Her body screamed for blood, for the rush of satisfaction it brought. It felt so close now, just out of reach, and all she had to do was embrace it. But the thought of losing herself, of giving in to something so monstrous, was a prison she refused to live in. She turned on her heel, quickly retracing her steps back to the edge of the alley, to the street beyond. She had to move. She couldn't stay here, not with the hunger clawing at her insides, making it harder to think. She needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere she could regain control before it overtook her completely. The streets, once familiar, now felt foreign, like the whole world was warping under the weight of her transformation. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep running, but she would. Try. She had to try. Suddenly, she heard something, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, the familiar panic rushing back to the surface. She turned her head slightly, trying to see who was following her, but the street was empty. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Isla stopped in her tracks. Her senses were heightened, every nerve on edge as she scanned the street. Nothing. There was no one there. Then, a figure stepped out from behind a nearby building, moving with the quiet precision of someone who was very familiar with the shadows. It was another woman, but this one had a wildness about her, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hunger, her movements jerky, almost predatory. The woman looked as if she hadn't seen a single person for days, her clothes torn, her hair matted and dirty. She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Isla, and Isla immediately tensed. Something about her felt off, dangerous. You, the woman rasped, her voice hoarse. You're infected too. Isla took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for something to defend herself, though she knew there was nothing. The hunger swirled inside her, reacting to the stranger's presence, as if it were calling to her. The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. You feel it, don't you? The hunger. It doesn't stop. It never will. Isla's breath hitched. The hunger in her surged in response to the woman's words, sharp and undeniable. It was like the infection was alive, a sentient thing, recognizing its own kind. And, I'm not like you, Isla said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. Her breath was ragged, the hunger rising again, but she fought it back. I won't let it take me. The woman's smile widened, almost too wide, stretching her face in an unnatural way. You think you have a choice? We don't have a choice. You'll feel it soon enough. The hunger will consume you. Isla's heart pounded as the woman took one more step toward her, and before Isla could react, the woman lunged. It happened so quickly, too quickly. Isla barely had time to defend herself. The stranger's teeth sank into her arm, the sharp pain shooting through her body as she screamed in agony. It was as though the hunger inside Isla woke up in that moment. It was like a switch had been flipped. The urge to fight back, to feed, took over, and for a brief second, Isla could feel herself losing control. The infection's call echoed in her mind, urging her to give in, to feed on the woman who was now attached to her arm. But Isla couldn't let herself become this. With a scream of her own, she forced the woman off of her, shoving her back with every ounce of strength she had left. The woman stumbled, her eyes wild, but her mouth continued to open and close like a predator's, her breath heavy and uneven. Isla staggered back, her blood dripping onto the pavement, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had to get away. She couldn't let the infection take her, Not like this, not in a moment of weakness. She ran, faster this time, away from the crazed woman, away from the hunger. Her mind spun, her body trembling with the effort to maintain control. Her arm throbbed where the woman had bitten her, but she refused to look at it. She couldn't afford to let it distract her. She had to keep moving. Somehow, in the midst of everything, she knew there was only one place she could go, one person who might still be able to help. Ryan, please be alive, she thought desperately, pushing herself harder, faster. The hunger inside her didn't care. It wanted blood, it wanted to feed, but Isla's mind was focused. There was one way left to fight it, one person who might be able to help her stop this madness. And she would get to him, no matter the cost. Isla's legs burned as she pushed forward, each step feeling like it might be her last. But she couldn't slow down. The alleyways blurred into one long stretch of concrete as she ran, her thoughts fragmented by the rush of adrenaline and the gnawing hunger clawing at her insides. She couldn't afford to stop, not until she reached Ryan, not until she knew if he was still alive. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her arm, still bleeding from the woman's bite, pulsed with sharp pain. But it was the hunger, that insatiable craving, that demanded her attention. She could feel it inside her, an unrelenting force that made her skin prickle, her teeth ache, her mind darken. Everywhere she turned, shadows seemed to press closer, threatening to swallow her whole. The infection was growing stronger, feeding on her weakness, feeding on her fear. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't lose herself completely. The streets felt emptier now, as though the city had been abandoned overnight. The echoes of distant voices, once familiar, had been replaced by the unsettling sound of her own footsteps. She could feel the shift in the air, the city's pulse just as frantic as her own. She slowed for a moment, eyes darting around. The hunger was still there, relentless. It gnawed at the back of her mind, making it harder to focus, harder to think straight. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to keep moving. She couldn't hear anything now. No sirens, no distant voices. The world felt muted, as if all the life had been drained from it. Then, as she neared a corner, she froze. A figure was standing there, silhouetted against the flickering light of a street lamp. At first, she thought it was just another shadow, a trick of her exhausted mind. But as she got closer, her pulse quickened. She could feel it. Ryan. He was standing there, still his back to her. His hair was messy, his clothes tattered, but there was something about him that made her breath catch. It was him, but something was off. Ryan, she called softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. He didn't move. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer, the gnawing hunger now roaring inside her. The blood in her veins seemed to run cold as she wondered if this was some cruel trick. Was he real? Was he alive? Or was this some sick illusion created by the infection? Ryan, she whispered again, more desperately this time. The figure turned slowly, and Isla's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were hollow, empty. The once familiar warmth of his gaze was gone, replaced by an unnatural blankness. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and there was something about the way he moved that made her blood run cold. He wasn't the Ryan she remembered. This was something else. Isla stumbled back a step, her pulse racing. "What happened to you?" she asked, though she already knew. It was the infection. The thing that had taken root inside of her now had taken root in him too. Ryan's lips curled into a twisted smile, a grin too wide, too unnatural to be comforting. "I'm fine," he rasped, his voice low and hoarse. "I'm not like you. I don't need to fight it. I've embraced it. We all do, eventually." Isla's stomach turned as she took another step back, her heart pounding in her ears. Her eyes darted to his neck, where the veins were darker than they should have been, pulsing in unnatural patterns. "Ryan, no," she whispered, shaking her head. You're not him." A low chuckle escaped his lips, and he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Oh, but I am. And you'll be too. You just need to stop fighting. Embrace the hunger, Isla. Let in. It's what we're made for. Isla's hands were shaking, the hunger inside her rising again, clawing at her from every direction. She felt it pulling her closer to him, like a magnet, the temptation to let go screaming louder than her thoughts. She could smell it, the blood pulsing beneath his skin, the life that was still there, even if he was barely human anymore. But something inside her snapped. No! Isla's voice was fierce now, a forcible she didn't even know she had. I won't be like you. Ryan's smile faltered for just a moment, confusion crossing his face. But then it was gone, replaced by that cold, hollow look again. He lunged forward, faster than she could react, his hand grabbing her wrist with terrifying strength. You don't have a choice, he whispered, his breath rancid with decay. We all succumb eventually. It's inevitable. The hunger was overwhelming now, making her body tremble, but Isla didn't give in. She fought with every ounce of strength she had left. With a burst of adrenaline, she yanked her arm free, stumbling back several steps. Her breathing was ragged, her thoughts muddled, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give in. She needed to survive. Ryan advanced again, but this time, Isla was ready. Her arm, despite the pain from the bite, shot out, slamming into his chest with all the force she could muster. Ryan staggered back, shock written across his face as he faltered for a moment. He seemed real again, vulnerable even, but just as quickly, his predatory grin returned. Isla backed away, her pulse racing, heart hammering against her ribs. She had to get away from him. But how could she, when he was already so much further gone than she was? A flash of movement caught her eye. Across the street, in the shadows of another alley, she saw a figure watching them, a man. He was cloaked in darkness, his face hidden, but something about the way he stood, so still and patient, made her gut tighten with unease. Ryan's eyes flicked to the figure, and for a moment, there was something like recognition in his gaze. It was fleeting, but it was enough for Isla to realize that whoever that person was, they were part of this twisted reality too. But before she could react, Ryan lunged again, and this time, Isla didn't have the strength to fight him off. His hand gripped her throat, forcing her backward. The hunger roared, louder than ever before, threatening to drown her. And then, everything went black. Isla's world spun into darkness as Ryan's grip tightened around her throat, the pressure cutting off her breath. Her vision blurred, and her thoughts became a chaotic mess of hunger and fear. Her body screamed for oxygen, for release, but the infection within her fought back, pulsing, twisting, clawing at her insides. It was as though the infection wanted her to give in, to allow Ryan to win, to become part of whatever this nightmare had turned him into. Her heart pounded in her ears, but just when she thought she would suffocate, a voice rang out from the darkness. Enough. The word was sharp, commanding, and for a split second, Ryan froze. Isla gasped for air, her lungs burning as she tried to push his hand away, but his grip was like iron. But the voice, powerful, authoritative, spoke again, and this time, Isla could feel the tension in Ryan's body snap. He released his hold on her, stumbling back with a strangled sound, as though something had forced him away. Isla collapsed to the ground, her hands clutching at her throat as she sucked in a desperate breath. Her body trembled violently, the hunger roaring inside her, urging her to feed, but she forced it down, focusing on the voice that had just saved her life. She looked up, barely able to see through the blur of exhaustion and pain, but there, emerging from the shadows, was the figure she had seen before. The man who had been watching them from across the street. He was tall, his features hidden beneath a dark hood, and his movements were slow but deliberate. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the pavement as he approached Isla. She couldn't make out his face, his hood obscured it, but there was something unnerving about his presence. He radiated power, a calm, controlled aura that seemed to silence the chaos in her mind. Ryan, still on the ground, looked at him with a mixture of fury and fear. His eyes, now wild with hunger, locked onto Isla. "You don't understand," he growled. "You can't stop it. None of us can." The man's voice was cold, almost disinterested as he looked down at Ryan, who was struggling to push himself up. "You're right. We can't, but we can control it. Some of us have learned how." Ryan's eyes flashed with confusion and rage, but before he could respond, the man turned to Isla. She was still on the ground, trying to regain her strength, her head swimming. "Are you done running?" the man asked, his voice carrying a strange weight to it. Isla blinked, trying to focus. She felt the hunger, the infection pushing against her every nerve. But there was something different about this man. He wasn't like Ryan. He wasn't like Lena. He was different. He felt like the calm in the storm. "Who are you?" she croaked, her voice raspy and weak. The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering her question. "I'm someone who's been through what you're going through, and I can help you." Ryan, still on the ground, spat out a curse. "Help her? You can't help her. This is what we are now. What you are now. She'll turn just like the rest of us. She'll give in just like..." The man's hand shot out, swift and precise. In one fluid motion, he silenced Ryan with a single, cold gesture, a flick of his wrist that seemed to stop the air around him. Ryan froze, his mouth still moving, but no sound emerging. It was as if the man had rendered him completely mute, like a puppet with its strings cut. Isla watched in stunned silence, the hunger threatening to take over as she observed the man's every movement. There was something almost otherworldly about him, something she couldn't quite understand. "You're still fighting it," the man said softly, turning his gaze back to Isla. "But for how much longer?" Isla's throat ached from Ryan's grip, but she didn't respond immediately. She couldn't let herself be distracted by the hunger. Not now. "What do you mean? What's happening to me? What are you?" The man sighed a long, tired sound. "I've been where you are. I've been fighting the hunger for years. The infection doesn't just take your body, it takes your mind. But there's a way to control it, to stop it from completely consuming you." Isla's heart pounded again as the words sunk in. She couldn't breathe. "Control it?" she whispered. "Is that even possible?" The man's eyes softened, a strange empathy in his gaze as he crouched in front of her. "It is, but it requires discipline, focus. You can't let the hunger control you. You have to master it before it masters you." Ryan struggled against whatever force was holding him still, his eyes wild with desperation. "You're lying," he screamed, but no sound came out. He tried to reach for Isla, but the invisible hold on him kept him pinned in place. The man ignored him, focusing entirely on Isla. "If you keep fighting it blindly, it will destroy you. You'll lose everything you care about. You'll become a creature like him." He nodded toward Ryan, who was still trapped in silence, his eyes flashing with hatred. Isla's mind reeled as she processed his words. She could already feel the hunger building inside her, clawing at her thoughts. But now there was something else, a small, fragile hope. Was it possible to hold on to herself? To stop from becoming like Ryan? Like Lena? "Why help me?" she asked, her voice hoarse but curious. "Why now?" The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "Because I see the same spark in you that I saw in myself once. You're not beyond saving, Isla, but you need to learn how to control the hunger before it controls you." The silence between them stretched as Isla took a shaky breath, trying to understand what he was offering. Her mind screamed at her to reject it, to run, to escape. But the hunger was louder, growing stronger by the second. It felt like a battle she couldn't win alone. "Please," she whispered, almost pleading. "I can't do this by myself." The man reached out a hand, steady and calm. "Then come with me. Let me show you how to fight back." Isla hesitated, her breath shallow, eyes darting between the man and Ryan, who was still frozen in place, his face contorted in anger and desperation. She could feel the hunger inside her, sharp and insistent, tugging at the edges of her consciousness. It was so close to overwhelming her, so close to taking her under. But the man in front of her, he seemed different. He didn't radiate the same madness she had seen in Lena or the twisted hunger that consumed Ryan. There was control in his eyes. Discipline. Something she had longed for but couldn't find within herself. Her hand twitched at her side, the urge to flee gnawing at her. But she knew, deep down, she was running out of time. She couldn't outrun the infection forever. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The man's eyes softened for a moment, and his lips parted, as if to say something, but he paused. Instead, he straightened and looked past her, toward the dark horizon. "There's no time for explanations right now. We have to move," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "They'll be here soon." Isla's heart skipped a beat. They? She couldn't afford to waste any more time. Her senses were on high alert, her mind running on autopilot as the fear from Ryan's attack pulsed in her chest. She was exposed, vulnerable. Without waiting for a response, the man reached down and grabbed her arm, lifting her effortlessly to her feet. Despite the burning pain in her limbs, Isla couldn't deny the strength in his grip, the sense of security that radiated from him. "Come with me," he urged again, pulling her in the direction of the alley. His hand, though firm, was not harsh. It was as if he knew how fragile she felt right now. He led her through the dark streets, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. Isla's mind raced. What had he meant by they? Who was coming? The last thing she needed was to walk right into another trap, but the hunger, it was eating at her. Every step she took was a battle between her mind and the insatiable urge to feed. She could hear her pulse in her ears, feel the blood rushing beneath her skin, and she knew she wouldn't last much longer. She needed control. She needed to know what this man was offering. "Who are they?" she asked again, her voice trembling. The man glanced over his shoulder at her, but didn't slow his pace. "It's not just the infection you have to worry about. There are others like us, those who have fallen completely to it. They'll hunt you down if they smell you." Isla's heart lurched. "Hunt me down? Why?" "They want to bring you into their fold. They'll try to turn you, make you one of them," he said, his voice cool, almost detached, though his words carried a weight of experience. "They're far worse than what you've encountered so far. Far more dangerous." Isla stumbled for a moment, her mind struggling to catch up. The infection was bad enough, but there were others out there, people who had already crossed the line, people who had given in completely. Her pulse quickened, her hand trembling as she clutched at her side. She was so close to losing herself, to becoming like them. She didn't want that. She couldn't. "Are you one of them?" she asked, voice tight. The man didn't look at her, but his jaw tightened slightly. "No," he said shortly. "I've learned to control it. That's why I'm still here." Isla studied his profile as they moved, noting the set of his shoulders, the quiet tension in the way he carried himself. He wasn't like Ryan. He wasn't completely lost. That gave her hope, a tiny ember in the growing darkness that threatened to consume her. They turned a corner, and she saw an old warehouse ahead. It was nothing special, just a forgotten building, crumbling under the weight of time. But the man led her toward it with purpose. Inside, he urged, his grip tightening just slightly around her arm. Quickly, without another word, he pulled open a door at the back of the warehouse, and they stepped into the dim light. The interior was cold, concrete floors covered in dust, boxes and crates scattered around, some old equipment tucked away in dark corners. It felt abandoned, isolated. The man closed the door behind them, then locked it with a quick motion. "Stay here for now," he said, looking around the space with a practiced eye. He didn't seem worried, but Isla could see the lines of tension around his mouth, the tightness of his stance. He was waiting for something or someone. Isla took a shaky step inside, her legs threatening to give out beneath her as the full weight of her exhaustion settled in. The hunger still gnawed at her, relentless. Her blood was a symphony of ache and fire, her mind teetering on the edge. She had no idea how much longer she could hold out before the hunger took over. "Will you teach me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but desperation in it. "How do you control it? How do you stop them from taking over?" The man turned slowly, his eyes dark but calm. "You learn to control your body first, and your mind. The hunger is an instinct, but it's also a choice. If you can master your instincts, then you can stop it from controlling you." Isla felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. A choice? Could it really be that simple? Or was it more of a lie to keep her from completely giving in? "What if I can't control it?" she whispered, voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to one of the crates and lifted the lid, revealing a set of tools, and something more, a large glass vial filled with a deep red liquid. He held it up to the light, the liquid swishing gently inside. "This," he said quietly, "is the last piece of the puzzle. It's a cure of sorts. It slows the infection, gives you time to learn control." He looked at her, a slight edge to his voice. "But it's dangerous. The dosage is tricky and too much. We'll kill you." Isla's throat tightened as she looked at the vial. "A cure? But dangerous? I don't know if I can make it on my own," she said softly, feeling the weight of her own words sink in. The man's eyes softened for a brief moment, and he set the vial down on the crate. "Then let's take it one step at a time." But before Isla could respond, a sharp, unnatural sound echoed from outside the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable noise of something, or someone, scraping against the door. The man's expression hardened. "They're here," he muttered. "Stay close. This is where the real test begins." The sound outside grew louder, more frantic, scratching, tapping, an odd, rhythmic knocking that seemed too deliberate to be an accident. Isla's pulse quickened, and she instinctively pressed herself back against the wall, her eyes darting to the door as though expecting it to burst open at any second. The man moved with a calm urgency, slipping behind a stack of crates near the back of the warehouse. His eyes flicked toward Isla, and he raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Isla's breath hitched, her hands trembling, but she nodded. The hunger was still there, clawing at her insides, but was the sound outside, those sounds that made her heart race. Whoever was out there, they weren't just infected. They weren't just hunting. There was something deliberate in the way they moved, and that unsettled Isla more than the hunger ever could. She crouched low, sliding to the edge of the crates, her breath shallow. Her eyes never left the door as the scratching continued. Whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't just looking for shelter. They were hunting. The man, now crouched beside her, didn't say anything. He simply waited, his gaze sharp, his muscles coiled and ready. Isla had the sense that he had been here before. He knew this was coming, and that terrified her more than anything. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a deep, rattling growl. It wasn't a human growl, but something twisted, something wrong. The sound sent a chill down Isla's spine, her skin prickling as the hunger inside her grew louder, urging her to feed. The man shifted, his eyes flicking toward her. He must have noticed her reaction, the way her hands clenched into fists as she fought to keep herself from breaking. The infection was louder now, feeding on her fear, but he didn't say a word. He simply kept his gaze locked on the door, waiting. Isla could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty space. Her mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. Who were these people? Were they the ones who had infected Ryan, or were they something far worse? The thought made her stomach twist. Then, with a sudden violent bang, the door to the warehouse splintered, with cracking as something or someone tried to force its way inside. Isla's heart stopped. The door wasn't going to hold much longer. She could see the darkness beyond it, the vague silhouettes of shapes moving in the shadows. More of them. She didn't know how many, but from the way they moved, erratically, yet with purpose, she could tell that they were different from what she'd seen before. The man glanced at her, his eyes narrowing in warning. Without another word, he stood, his movements fluid, almost predatory. Isla froze, unsure whether to run or stay, but the man gave her one last, sharp glance, one that told her she didn't have a choice. "Stay low," he commanded quietly, his voice low and controlled. "Do not engage. If they're here, they've already sensed you." Before she could reply, he was gone, slipping into the shadows of the warehouse with the speed and precision of a predator. Isla stayed crouched, trembling, her breath held tight in her chest as the man moved toward the other side of the room. Her body was screaming for release, the hunger gnawing at her once again, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. The door cracked open with a sickening screech, and the first figure slipped inside, followed by several others. They moved with an eerie coordination, as though they were part of a larger group, a pack. The hunger inside Isla flared as she saw them clearly for the first time. Pale, sickly figures with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, their skin stretched tight over bones, their movements jerky and unnatural. They weren't just infected. They were something else. The man was already on the move, silent and swift. He darted between the crates, disappearing into the shadows as the infected began to spread throughout the warehouse, their heads swiveling as they scanned for any sign of movement. Isla's heart pounded. The hunger was almost unbearable now. It was all she could focus on, the need to feed to stop the gnawing inside of her. She could feel it consuming her, like fire spreading through her veins. Her vision blurred, the edges of her sight turning darker, more like the world through a fog. But then she saw him. The man was moving again, coming toward her, but it wasn't his eyes that made her freeze. It was the other thing in his hand. A small, dark blade, thin and deadly, glinting in the dim light. He reached her in an instant, his hand covering her mouth before she could react. His voice was a mere whisper in her ear. "Do not scream." The words cut through the fog in her mind, and Isla's heart slammed against her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to stop the hunger from swallowing her whole, but she forced herself to stay still. Her eyes locked on his, a silent promise that she wouldn't give in, at least not yet. The infected were closing in, and Isla could feel the tension in the air, the unmistakable moment before a fight would erupt. The man's grip tightened on her arm, and without warning, he pulled her toward a dark corner of the warehouse, hiding them both behind a stack of crates. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and for a split second, she felt his presence beside her, grounding her. The hunger for that moment faded into the background, like the quiet hum of an engine just out of reach. They waited in silence. The infected passed them by, their grotesque forms moving with a sickening grace, their heads tilted like animals hunting at night. Isla could hear the faint rasp of their breath, the clattering of their feet on the concrete floor. The man didn't move. He didn't flinch. His focus was absolute. And then, just as quickly as they had come, the figures were gone, retreating into the shadows as if they had never been there. Isla's body still shook with adrenaline. She wanted to breathe, but the air felt too thin. Her head spun, the hunger rising once again, roaring louder than before. But the man was already standing, his eyes scanning the room. "We're not out of the woods yet," he murmured. "But we're safe for now." Isla swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she managed to nod. "What? Were they?" she whispered. The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. "The hunters," he said softly, "and they are far more dangerous than the infection itself." Isla tried to absorb what he'd said, but her mind was still clouded by the hunger gnawing at her insides, the twisted pull in her gut that threatened to take over at any second. The man seemed to understand the battle she was fighting because, without hesitation, he offered her the vial from earlier. "Here," he said, his voice steady, almost reassuring. "Take a sip. It'll help." Isla's hand shook as she reached for the vial. Her fingers brushed against the cool glass, and for a moment, she hesitated. The liquid inside glowed faintly in the dim light, a deep red, almost like blood. Her stomach twisted at the thought, the hunger surging within her. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice ragged. The urge to feed was so overwhelming now, so close to taking her entirely. But there was something about the vial, something that promised a bit of reprieve. She knew she couldn't keep fighting it forever. "You can," the man said firmly, his tone brokering no argument. "It's not just a cure. It's your only chance to regain control. If you wait too long, you won't be able to stop it. You'll become like them." He was right. Isla could feel the infection rising up inside her, the edges of her vision darkening. If she didn't act soon, there was no telling what would happen. She could feel herself slipping. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. With trembling hands, she uncorked the vial, the smell of it almost sickening. There was a metallic tang to it, like iron. Without thinking, she tilted the vial to her lips and drank. The liquid was cold, too cold, and it slid down her throat like fire and ice. For a moment, there was nothing, just a sharp, burning sensation that made her eyes water. But then, a wave of relief washed over her. The hunger, the maddening, ravenous hunger, retreated slightly, like a tide pulling away from the shore. It didn't vanish completely, but it was more manageable now, as though the storm had been temporarily quelled. Isla exhaled slowly, the sharpness of her breath returning as the fog in her mind lifted, just enough for her to think clearly again. Her hands stopped shaking, though they still trembled slightly from the strain. "It's working," she murmured, staring down at the empty vial in her hand. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her closely, his eyes sharp, observant. "For now," he said finally. "But you have to be careful. It's not a permanent fix. The infection will start to regain control soon, unless you learn how to fight it off completely." Isla felt a shiver of unease creep up her spine. The hunger was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, and she knew the relief she felt now wouldn't last forever. But at least she had time. At least she had a chance. The man stepped away from her, moving silently toward the door they had come through earlier. His every movement was fluid, like he was aware of every single sound in the room. It made Isla's own movements feel clumsy by comparison. She wasn't used to this level of caution, this constant sense of impending danger. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady now, but laced with uncertainty. "There's a safe house," he replied, without turning around. "It's not far. We need to stay off the streets as much as possible. If those hunters are out there, we can't risk being seen." Isla nodded, though her thoughts were still swirling. Hunters. They weren't just mindless infected. There was something far worse, something controlled. She needed answers, but she also needed to stay alive. With one last glance around the warehouse, the man motioned for her to follow. Isla didn't hesitate this time. She moved quickly, keeping her movements as quiet as possible. Her senses were sharp now. She could hear the faintest scuff of their shoes against the concrete, the scrape of metal on metal from somewhere in the distance. The warehouse felt like a ticking time bomb, every sound amplified in the silence. The man led her through the labyrinth of crates, each step calculated. As they moved deeper into the shadows of the building, Isla couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping in again. Her hand still held the vial's empty glass, and the hunger had quieted, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. They reached another door, and the man paused. He pressed his ear against it, listening for a moment before slowly turning the handle. It creaked, but the door didn't budge. He gave it a nudge, and it opened with a sharp hiss, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "This way," he said, stepping down first, his movements deliberate and calm. Isla followed, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the weight of what was happening was settling over her. What were the hunters? What did he mean by learning to fight the infection off? Was that even possible? And how long before the hunger came back in full force? She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going like this. Her mind, though clearer, was still scattered with questions, and the answers, if they were even possible, felt so far out of reach. But for now, there was only one thing she could do: keep following the man, stay alive, and hope that, somehow, she could learn to control this thing inside of her before it consumed everything. The stairwell led them deeper underground, and the further they descended, the more the air around them felt stale, like the world above had been forgotten long ago. There were no windows, no light except the dim glow of a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. It felt like they were walking into the belly of something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. At the bottom, the man stopped in front of a door that looked out of place, too old and worn compared to the rest of the space. He didn't speak as he opened it, but Isla felt the chill in the air, something that told her they were about to step into a whole new world. And then they were inside. The room was smaller than she expected, its walls lined with shelves of supplies and strange equipment she didn't recognize. But there was one thing that stood out. In the far corner of the room, sitting against the wall, was a figure. The faint glow of their eyes shimmered in the dark. Isla froze. She wasn't sure if it was the hunger or the fear, but her mind raced. Who was this? Meet Caleb, the man said, his tone tight but measured. Caleb slowly looked up, revealing a face that was eerily calm. Too calm. There was something about him that reminded Isla of the hunters she'd seen earlier. Those creatures who weren't fully human, but still too aware of what they were. "We've been waiting for you," Caleb said quietly. Isla's heart skipped a beat as Caleb's eyes locked on hers. There was a strange, unsettling stillness in his gaze, like he was sizing her up, judging her before she even had the chance to move. The faint glow of his eyes seemed almost unnatural in the dim light, but what unsettled Isla most was the calm that radiated from it. It was too calm. She took a hesitant step forward, instinctively shifting closer to the man who had been guiding her, her only source of relative safety. Who? Who is he? Isla's voice was shaky, her fear creeping back in. The man, who had been watching Caleb with a mix of wariness and something else, something hard to place, turned to her. His expression softened slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "Caleb's like me," he said simply. "And like you now, he's another one of us, someone who's been infected, but managed to hold on to his humanity." The word humanity struck Isla like a slap to the face. She was still fighting to hold onto hers. She wasn't sure how long that would last, how long she could fight the insatiable hunger tearing at her insides. Caleb slowly rose from the corner where he'd been sitting, his movements deliberate, yet smooth. As he stood, he made no attempt to hide the strange aura that surrounded him. There was something almost ethereal about the way he carried himself. It was the way he was able to remain so still, so centered, while everyone else around him seemed to be on edge. He tilted his head slightly as he regarded Isla. "You look like you're struggling," he said, his voice soft but thick with an undertone she couldn't place. "I can see it in your eyes. You're trying to hold on, but the hunger is a stronger pull than you realize." Isla's blood ran cold. How could he tell? Was it that obvious? She instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, trying to quell the unease that was rising in her chest. "I know what it feels like," Caleb continued, his tone strangely soothing despite the words themselves. "I was where you are. The hunger doesn't stop. It always finds a way to get louder, and then you're gone, but there's a way to keep it at bay." The man who had been guiding her stepped forward now, his hands clenched at his sides, a flicker of tension crossing his face. "Don't listen to him," he said, his voice low but intense. "He's been surviving too long on that damn cure. He doesn't understand what it's like to fight every day to stay in control." Caleb's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile curving his mouth, though it was hard to say whether it was mocking or knowing. "I know what I'm talking about," he said, his voice unwavering. "You can't keep running from it. The infection is inside you, Isla. It will never go away. Not completely. But if you want to survive, you have to accept it, learn to use it. or you'll lose yourself, just like everyone else. Isla's stomach churned at his words. She wasn't sure which part of her was more terrified, the hunger or the thought of accepting this twisted version of herself. Could she really learn to live with the infection, to control it? Or was she already too far gone? Use it? Isla asked, her voice hoarse, desperate for any kind of answer. Caleb's gaze never wavered. You'll have to face the truth sooner or later. The infection is a part of you now. You can't outrun it. You can only control it. Harness it. Become something. More. Her head spun with confusion. The hunger inside her flared at his words. More? Was that what she was becoming? Was that what he meant? The man beside her, her reluctant protector, shook his head, his jaw clenched. Don't listen to him. He's just like the others, the ones who think they can control it and feed it. You'll lose yourself. I won't let you go down that path. His tone was resolute, but there was something else, something darker. He was afraid of Caleb, of what he might represent. Isla looked between them, torn. The hunger inside her felt like a living thing, constantly clawing, shifting, changing. Caleb seemed so calm, like he had it all figured out, like he had become one with the infection. But the man who had brought her here seemed to fear that path. Was it really as simple as Caleb made it sound? Is that why you're still alive? Isla asked, trying to piece together the mystery of Caleb's calm demeanor. Because you embrace it? Caleb smiled faintly. It's not about embracing it. It's about acceptance. Denial only makes it worse. Trust me, I've seen it. The ones who refuse to accept it, who try to outrun it, they die. Slowly, painfully, until nothing's left but the hunger. The man beside her clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. I've watched enough people break because of that philosophy. I won't let you become one of them. I won't. The tension in the room was palpable. Isla could feel the weight of their conflicting ideologies pressing in on her, pulling her in different directions. Caleb's calm certainty. The man's raw, desperate fear of what would happen if Isla let the infection consume her. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. The hunger was there, always lurking in the background, pushing at the edges of her control. I don't know what to believe, she murmured. Her voice was barely a whisper, like the words were fragile, hanging in the air between them. I don't know if I could trust either of you. For the first time since meeting Caleb, the calm expression on his face faltered. His smile dropped, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. You don't have to trust us, he said, his voice low and measured. But you need to trust yourself. This isn't about us. It's about you. It always has been. Isla's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever path she chose, it wouldn't be easy. Caleb took a slow step back, his gaze never leaving hers. We'll see how long you last, Isla. The hunger's a lot more powerful than you think. The man beside her remained rigid, his eyes hard. He turned to her, a silent promise that he would protect her, even if it meant taking on Caleb himself. Isla took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever came next. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep holding on, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny sliver of hope. And that at least was something. Isla's fingers tightened around the edges of her sleeve, as if trying to anchor herself in the midst of the confusion swirling around her. Caleb's words hung heavily in the air, and she could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Was she supposed to accept the infection, let it consume her slowly until there was nothing left but the hunger, or fight it with every ounce of strength she had, risking it all to remain human? She glanced at the man standing next to her, the one who had kept her alive so far, whose presence still felt like the only thing standing between her and madness. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something raw and desperate, that told her he feared Caleb's way of thinking, feared what might happen if she took that path. Caleb's wrong, the man said, his voice rough, almost as if he was speaking through clenched teeth. You can control it, Isla. You can. His eyes met hers with an intensity that left her feeling both grounded and unnerved. Don't listen to him. I know what this is like. I've been through it too, and I'll help you fight it. We'll figure this out together. Isla swallowed hard. She could feel the hunger stirring again. Just beneath the surface, a quiet growl in the pit of her stomach. She knew the man was right in some ways. He had been the one to show her what control looked like. But Caleb's words echoed in her mind, tempting her to consider a path that might be easier, less exhausting. To simply embrace it. To let the infection do what it was always going to do and see where it led. But as Caleb's piercing eyes locked onto hers again, she could feel the subtle pull of that dangerous path. Something in him seemed almost too comfortable with the infection, like he had made peace with it long ago. And that made Isla shiver. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain of it all. I don't know how to fight this hunger. You can, the man repeated, his voice steady but insistent. I've seen it. You've already done it once. The cure, it's not a permanent fix, but it's enough to give you time to learn how to control it, how to fight it back. Caleb's lips twitched in a half smile. That's the thing, though. You're always fighting it, always pushing it down. It's exhausting, isn't it? Why waste your energy on resistance when you can embrace it? If you give in, you'll find your true strength. The infection isn't your enemy, it's your ally. If you're strong enough to control it, you can use it to your advantage. It'll make you more. Isla's eyes flicked between Caleb and the man at her side. The internal struggle was burning inside her, and she felt like she was caught in a vice, squeezed between two choices she couldn't fully understand. I've seen what happens to people who give in, the man finally said, his voice cold with memories. You'll lose yourself. I've seen it, people who let the infection take over because they thought it would make them stronger. It doesn't. It turns them into monsters. I won't let you do that. The words stung, the truth behind them cutting through the fog in her mind. She thought of the things she'd seen, the horrors she'd witnessed, people twisted into something unrecognizable by the infection. Could she really risk becoming one of those things? I don't want to be a monster, Isla said softly, the weight of her own fear almost suffocating. She met Caleb's eyes, trying to steady her breathing. But I don't know how much longer I can fight this. Caleb watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first, letting her words settle. Finally, he spoke, his tone surprisingly gentle. You don't have to fight it forever, Isla, he said, his voice low and almost coaxing. It's a losing battle. The hunger will always come back. The infection will always be there, clawing at you, dragging you toward the edge. Why fight it when you can just let go? It will give you power, real power. Isla felt a chill slide through her, a shiver creeping up her spine at the way Caleb spoke. There was a temptation in his words, a seductive ease about it. But beneath it, there was something darker, something she wasn't sure she could trust. I don't know if I can trust you, Isla whispered, more to herself than to him. But Caleb's sharp gaze was already trained on her. That's the problem, Caleb replied, his voice soft but insistent. No one can trust me. No one can trust anyone anymore. Not when the world is like this. He paused, his eyes flicking toward the man standing beside her. That's why you need to trust yourself. You need to find your own way. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, but Isla couldn't decipher them. Was this the answer? Was she meant to embrace the infection, to give in to the hunger and let it make her stronger? Or was the man right? Could she really fight it and stay human? She turned away, pacing a few steps to clear her head. The room felt suddenly too small, too suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. Her breathing quickened, and for a split second, she thought she might actually feel the infection win, the hunger roaring louder than ever inside of her. But then, she felt a hand on her shoulder. The man, his touch was firm, reassuring, and it helped her center herself again. He didn't say anything, but just his presence made her feel grounded, like she wasn't entirely lost yet. I won't let you lose yourself, he said quietly. I won't let you go down the same path I saw so many others walk. Isla looked at him, meeting his steady gaze. His eyes were full of something something like hope, maybe, or maybe it was fear. Fear for her. I don't know what's right anymore, she said. Her We'll figure out together, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. One step at a time. Isla nodded, her breath slow and steadying. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let the hunger win. Not yet, and not if she had any say in it. We need to get moving, Caleb said after a long pause, his voice suddenly cold and cutting. The hunters are still out there. You'll make your decision sooner or later, Isla, but time is running out. The reminder snapped Isla back to reality. The urgency of their situation was too real to ignore. Hunters were still a threat, and whatever path she chose, she needed to stay alive long enough to make that choice. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever came next. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she knew she couldn't walk it alone. Let's go, she said quietly, her voice more certain than she felt. We move now, and we stay alive, no matter what. With a final glance at Caleb, whose unreadable expression was a constant reminder of how much she had yet to understand, Isla followed the man into the unknown. And whatever choice she made, she knew one thing. She had to keep fighting. The air was thick with tension as Isla followed the man, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the crumbling building. Caleb's voice lingered in her mind, a whispering temptation. It wasn't just the hunger that made him seem so convincing. It was the certainty in his tone, the way he seemed to have embraced the infection as part of himself. More, he had said, if you can control it, you become more. She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe it, because if she didn't, if she stayed in the fight, the struggle, the endless push against the hunger, she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. But then there was the man beside her, the one who had always been there to ground her, to remind her of what it meant to remain human. They reached the exit of the building, the dim light from the broken windows casting long shadows across the ground outside. The world beyond was just as bleak as she remembered it. Ruins, empty streets, scattered debris, and the constant threat of something lurking in the dark corners. Where to now? Isla asked, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb's words were still bouncing around in her head, taunting her with their simplicity. You could be more. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon, his posture tense. We need to head to the safe house. It's the only place where we can regroup and make a plan. We can't stay here long. He glanced over at her, his expression softer now, though still filled with worry. Are you sure you're okay? She nodded, though her insides felt like a storm was raging. The hunger wasn't just a gnawing ache anymore. It was a constant presence, like a dark whisper in the back of her mind. Caleb's words had reignited something in her, and now the temptation to give in was harder to ignore. I'm fine, she said, though she didn't believe it. Let's go. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, staying low to avoid drawing attention. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of a building or the scuttling sound of rats fleeing from them. Isla could feel the weight of the man's gaze on her, but she refused to meet it. She wasn't ready to talk about what Caleb had said. Not yet. After a few blocks, they reached a small, dilapidated house tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The man led her through the back in trance, making sure to check for any signs of danger before pulling her inside. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of stale air and dust, but it was familiar. It was the kind of place where survivors found shelter, where they could breathe for a moment before the world outside clawed its way back in. The man closed the door behind them and turned to her, his face drawn with exhaustion. We can't stay here long. The hunters will be looking for us. Isla nodded, her thoughts still swirling around Caleb's words. She needed answers. She needed to understand what more meant, and if it was really the answer. But there was something in her that held back, a fear she couldn't shake. What if giving in meant losing herself? What if it was the path that led to destruction? I don't know what to do anymore, she confessed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay strong. "I don't know if I can keep fighting." The man didn't speak at first, but his gaze softened, and he stepped closer to her. "I know it's hard. It's hard for all of us." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "But you're not alone. We'll figure this out together, okay? Whatever path you choose, I'll be right there with you." Isla looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity in them. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was still a chance for them to defeat the infection, to find a cure, or at least a way to keep the hunger at bay. But Caleb's words echoed too loudly in her mind. "You'll never outrun it. It's inside you now." Her breath hitched in her throat, and she turned away, pressing her hands against the cool, cracked walls of the house. The pressure inside her chest felt suffocating. "Isla," the man's voice was quiet, hesitant. "We'll get through this. You can control it. We've made it this far." The door behind them creaked, a sudden noise that cut through the tension in the room. Isla spun around, her heart pounding as she instinctively reached for a weapon she didn't have. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. The man's hand shot out, gripping her wrist gently but firmly, his eyes wide with panic. "Don't!" But then, before they could react, the door opened fully. Standing in the doorway was Caleb. He didn't enter right away, just stood there, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the room, as if he were the one in control, as if he already knew what was going to happen next. "You've made a mistake," Caleb said, his voice smooth, as if they had been expecting him all along. "Hiding here won't protect you forever. It never does." Isla's heart raced, her pulse quickening at the sight of him. How had he found them so quickly? Was he tracking them? Had he followed them all this way? The man beside her stepped forward, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, Isla could see the fury in his eyes. "We don't need your help, Caleb. We don't need anything from you." Caleb's gaze flicked to him, and for a brief moment his smile faded. "You're making the same mistake you always make," he said, his voice turning dark. "You think you can control the infection. You can't. You're too weak for that." And Isla, he turned his gaze to her, his eyes locking onto hers with that same unnerving calm. "She's running out of time." The words hit Isla like a punch to the gut. She felt the hunger flare again, stronger than before. It clawed at her insides, urging her to do something, anything to make it stop. Caleb's eyes never left hers. "You can still make the choice, Isla, but if you wait too long, it will be too late." Isla felt a cold sweat break out across her skin, her hands trembling as she looked at the two men standing in front of her. One was her anchor, the one who had kept her alive, the one who had fought alongside her in the past. The other was an enigma, a figure who had embraced the infection with an eerie calm and promised power if she followed his path. And for the first time since the infection had taken hold of her, Isla wasn't sure which way was the right way. The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unspoken choices, as Isla's gaze flicked between Caleb and the man who had kept her alive thus far. Caleb's presence was suffocating, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos raging within Isla. The hunger clawing inside her was louder than ever. She could feel it, a twisted sensation beneath her ribs, threatening to overtake her. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her thoughts clear. Caleb's words had resonated too deeply, too dangerously. If you wait too long, it will be too late. The infection was inside her, she knew it. It was only a matter of time before it would consume her completely. But could she really take Caleb's path? Could she truly embrace the infection, let it turn her into something more? Her fingers trembled at her sides, and she could feel the heat rising in her chest as the hunger stirred, like a beast eager to break free. She wanted to turn away, to ignore the dangerous allure of Caleb's words, but the temptation was almost too much. "You're wrong," the man beside her said, his voice rough but unwavering. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Isla and Caleb, as if to shield her from the dark promise Caleb represented. "You're not going to make her one of your puppets." Caleb raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "I'm not trying to control her," he said, his voice smooth. "I'm offering her freedom, the chance to take back what's hers. The infection isn't a curse, it's a gift. The ones who are truly strong don't fight it. They use it." Isla's chest tightened, her breath quickening as Caleb's words burrowed into her mind. She could feel it, the hunger calling, the craving for power, for release from the constant battle to stay human. Maybe it would be easier, she thought. Maybe I could just accept it. But she quickly shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts that were growing darker with every passing moment. She couldn't forget everything she had seen, people who had fallen to the infection, losing their humanity piece by piece, turning into something other. She refused to be like them. "Don't listen to him, Isla," the man said, his voice firm. "You can control it. We've been fighting together for so long. Don't let him make you doubt yourself." Isla closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling sharply, trying to steady her mind. The hunger inside her was growing, clawing at her, trying to make her decisions for her. "Give in," it whispered. "It will be so much easier if you just give in." She clenched her fists, holding on to what little control she had left. She had to make this choice. She had to choose the right path. Caleb took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You know it's true," he said, his voice almost soothing. "The infection is a part of you now. Fighting it only weakens you. Embrace it, and you'll be stronger than you've ever been. You can lead this world. You can control it." Isla's head spun. Could she? Could she really control this infection? Take what was already inside her and use it to her advantage? The temptation was strong, too strong. The hunger gnawed at her, urging her to make a choice, to do something, anything, to stop the ache that seemed to consume her. But she couldn't let it win. Not yet. She couldn't let the infection define her. She was more than just the hunger that lived inside her. "I won't become what you want me to be," Isla said, her voice stronger now, filled with a quiet resolve. She turned to the man beside her, her protector, the one who had always believed in her. "I'm not going to give in to this. Not now. Not ever." The man's gaze softened, a flicker of relief in his eyes, but Caleb's expression remained unchanged, almost disappointed. He studied Isla for a long moment, his face impassive, as if trying to gauge her resolve. "Do you think you're strong enough to resist it?" Caleb's voice was low, almost mocking. "I've seen too many people try to fight it. They all fail in the end." Isla shook her head, feeling a surge of defiance rise up within her. "Maybe they failed because they didn't have the strength to fight," she said, her voice unwavering. "Maybe they thought they had no other choice. But I have a choice. I will resist." Caleb's smile was faint, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see how long that lasts, Isla. We'll see how long your little game of resistance keeps you whole." Before she could respond, Caleb turned, his figure melting back into the shadows with a fluid grace. "You'll regret it," he called over his shoulder, his voice dripping with a quiet certainty. "But when the hunger finally takes you, don't say I didn't warn you." Isla stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The hunger was still there, pushing at the edges of her mind, but now it felt more distant, like a shadow she could still control. Her resolve strengthened with every second, the fear of Caleb's promise fading into the background. The man beside her exhaled, his posture relaxing slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "He'll be back. He'll keep trying to turn all of us into his way of thinking." Isla nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the spot where Caleb had disappeared into the darkness. "I won't let him win," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of conviction. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the distant groan of the building settling and the occasional scrape of wind outside. Then the man stepped closer to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said. "We'll survive. Together." Isla looked up at him, her heart heavy but determined. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy. The infection inside her wasn't going to go away, but she had made her choice. She wasn't going to give in. Not to Caleb. Not to the hunger. Not yet. The quiet of the room seemed to settle around Isla like a heavy blanket after Caleb's departure, but the unease lingered, thick in the air. Isla's thoughts were a whirlwind. Caleb's parting words echoed in her head like a whispered curse, filling her with doubt even as she clung to her resolve. "We'll see how long that lasts," he had said. "You'll regret it." But she wasn't going to let that fear take hold. She couldn't afford to. Not when every fiber of her being screamed to stay human, to stay herself. The man at her side didn't speak for a long while, as though giving her the space she needed to sort through the chaos in her mind. Isla felt a strange sense of gratitude for his quiet support. He wasn't pushing her, wasn't telling her what to do. He just was, in a world that had turned upside down, that was worth more than she could put into words. After a long silence, he finally broke it, his voice soft but insistent. "We need to move. The hunters will be coming soon, and we can't afford to sit here waiting for Caleb to make his next move." Isla's throat tightened as she nodded, forcing her thoughts back to the present. Stay alive. Stay human. The hunger gnawed at the back of her mind, relentless, but she couldn't give in. She wouldn't. "I know," she said, her voice steady, though there was a nervous edge to it. She glanced around the room one last time, taking in the dilapidated walls, the scattered furniture, the musty air. This place hadn't been a safe house in years. It was just a decaying shell now, another place to hide, if only temporarily. The man grabbed a dusty backpack from a shelf near the door and tossed it over his shoulder, eyes scanning the room one more time for any signs of danger. "We'll need supplies if we're going to make it to the next place. Water, food, weapons, whatever we can carry." Isla nodded again, her mind already moving to the next task. Every minute they stayed here was another minute they were vulnerable. The hunters wouldn't stop until they found them, and Caleb's strange power was always a wild card. She had no idea what kind of resources he had, but it was clear he wouldn't be easily deterred. They moved quickly, slipping out the back door and into the alley that led into the heart of the city. The streets were eerily silent, the only sound the soft scrape of their boots against the cracked pavement. As they walked, Isla's mind wandered back to Caleb. She could still feel his eyes on her, like a shadow at the edge of her vision. There was something about him that unsettled her. Something too calm about the way he spoke of the infection. He had embraced it, allowed it to take over, and now he was trying to convince others to do the same. But Isla had seen what happened to people like that. She had seen them fall apart, their humanity twisted into something monstrous, their faces barely recognizable under the weight of the infection. She wasn't ready to lose herself like that. The man beside her seemed to sense her unease, glancing over at her every few moments. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" Isla's eyes snapped to his, surprised by the directness of his question. She hesitated before speaking, not entirely sure what to say. She didn't want to admit how much Caleb's words had rattled her, how much they made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. "He's convincing," she said softly. "He believes it. He's so sure that this is the only way. And part of me," she trailed off, her words faltering. She didn't want to admit that there was a part of her that wanted to give in, that wanted to embrace the infection's call. The man didn't say anything for a moment, but his gaze softened. "You don't have to make any decisions right now. The choice isn't over. And you're stronger than you think. You've already resisted longer than anyone else I know. That counts for something." Isla's heart tightened, but she didn't answer. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the strength he saw in her. But the infection inside her was growing harder to ignore. It was always there, always pulling at her like a second heartbeat. She could feel it in every moment of silence, in every quiet step they took. They turned a corner and slipped into another narrow alley. The building in front of them was run down, much like the others they had passed, but this one had a faint glow coming from a crack in the boarded-up windows. It was their next stop, the only place they could afford to rest for a while. The man reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. Isla hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder as though expecting someone or something to be following them. But the street was empty. The hunters hadn't caught up yet. She stepped inside, her senses immediately alert. The small room was dimly lit, with only a few candles burning on the makeshift tables. It was clearly a hideout, temporary but functional. As they moved deeper into the space, Isla could see other survivors huddled in the corners, looking exhausted and wary. Some of them glanced up at them, but no one spoke. Everyone knew what it meant to survive in silence. The man dropped the bag onto a chair in the corner and went to speak with one of the survivors about the situation outside. Isla lingered by the window, watching the streets through. The cracks in the boards, her mind swirling with everything she had just witnessed. Caleb, the infection, the hunger, and yet there was a gnawing feeling in her gut, something she hadn't felt before. Something cold and sinister, like the shadow of the infection stretching further than just her own body. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find the man standing a few paces away, his expression unreadable. "We got to make a move soon," he said quietly. "We can't stay here long." Isla nodded, but her gaze drifted back to the street. There was something in the distance, something she couldn't quite make out. A figure? No, it was too far to tell. But as the figure grew clearer, a chill ran down her spine. The last thing she expected to see was Caleb standing in the middle of the street, eyes fixed on the building. And in that moment, Isla realized just how close she was to making a choice that could change everything. The sight of Caleb standing in the middle of the street, his gaze locked on the building, sent a wave of cold dread washing over Isla. Her heart thudded her chest as her body tensed, every instinct screaming that something wasn't right. Caleb had found them, and the unnerving calmness in his presence sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped back from the window, her hand brushing against the peeling paint of the wall behind her. She wanted to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for her to make a move. To do something. He knows, she thought. He knows that I'm still deciding, that I'm still resisting. The man beside her had already noticed her stiffened posture, his eyes following her gaze. He didn't need to ask. He could see the worry in her face. "What is it?" Isla didn't answer immediately, her mind racing. Caleb's presence outside the building was no coincidence. He had tracked them here, and now he was waiting for her to come out, waiting for her to join him. The hunger stirred in the pit of her stomach, a clawing, insistent pull that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. "He's out there," Isla finally said, her voice a whisper. "He's waiting for me." The man's expression darkened, his jaw tight. "We can't let him get to you. If he's come for you, we need to move fast. We can't stay here." But Isla couldn't tear her eyes away from the window, from Caleb's unblinking stare. There was something almost inviting about the way he stood there, his presence drawing her in, making the hunger inside her grow stronger. She knew what he wanted. He wanted her to come to him. He wanted her to surrender. Her fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting this. The infection felt like it was rising inside her, a tide that was threatening to overtake her completely. And Caleb, he had it all figured out. He had embraced the infection and transformed it into power. But that wasn't the path she wanted. She wouldn't give in to him. Not like this. She tore her gaze away from Caleb and turned to the man, her voice tight with urgency. "We can't stay here, but I can't go out there alone. I don't know if I can face him, not with everything inside me pulling me in his direction." The man's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. He stepped closer to her, his voice low and reassuring. "You don't have to face him alone. You've already made it this far. You're strong, Isla. We'll get through this together." For a moment, Isla felt a flicker of hope. The man had always been there for her through the darkest times. He had fought alongside her, kept her grounded, kept her human. But Caleb's words were still in her head, a siren song of power and ease. Yuinme, Isla. You can have everything. You can be free. I don't know what to do, Isla admitted, her voice cracking as the weight of the choice pressed down on her. She felt torn between the man she trusted and the pull of Caleb's promise of more. The infection inside her was growing louder, but it wasn't just the hunger. It was fear, too. Fear that the longer she resisted, the more she would lose herself. The man's eyes softened with compassion as he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The infection doesn't define you, Isla. It's a part of you, yes, but it's not who you are. You still have a choice. You always will. Isla swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She was so close to the edge, so close to falling into Caleb's world. But she had made it this far because of the choices she had made, because of the strength that still burned within her. And she wasn't ready to let it go. The tension in the room was thick as the sound of footsteps outside grew louder. Someone was approaching the building. Isla froze, her breath caught in her throat. The man beside her tightened his grip on the weapon at his side, his expression hardening. We need to move now. We don't have much time. Isla nodded, but her heart was pounding in her chest. The choice was clear now, wasn't it? Caleb was out there, waiting for her, ready to take her. And the man at her side, the one who had stood by her through everything, was offering her another chance. But how much longer could she resist? The man grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door. Come on, we're getting out of here. Isla hesitated for a split second, her gaze flicking back to the window. Caleb's figure had moved closer, his silhouette casting a long shadow against the cracked pavement. But then she looked at the man beside her, the one who had always kept her grounded, the one who still believed in her. With a deep breath, Isla turned away from the window. Let's go. The man didn't need to say anything. He led her out the back door, into the alley where the streetlights flickered dimly above them. The world outside was dangerous, but at least it was still hers. She wasn't going to let Caleb take that from her. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, careful not to draw attention. But every step Isla took, she could feel Caleb's eyes on her, his presence hanging over them like a dark cloud. The alley curved ahead, and they moved toward the next street, but Isla's heart was still racing. She had made her choice. But was it the right one? Caleb was out there, waiting, watching. Would he come after them? Would he keep pushing, keep trying to pull her into his world? And if he did, would she be strong enough to resist him? The hunger inside her was still there, gnawing at her. But now, she held on to something else, something that wasn't Caleb's offer of power. It was hope. It was the belief that, despite the infection, she was still human. She was still Isla, and that for now was enough. The night seemed darker than ever as they continued to move through the shadows, keeping close to the buildings, away from the streetlights. The urgency of their steps echoed in the alley, but there was an overwhelming silence between them. Isla's thoughts churned like a storm, the hunger gnawing at the back of her mind. Every so often, it felt as though she might lose control, just a little, but then the man's presence beside her grounded her, pulling her back. They reached the corner of the alley, where the faint glow of the streetlight ahead cut through the darkness. Isla froze, her senses heightening. Something wasn't right. The man beside her tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the blade at his side. Stay close, he whispered. We need to move quickly. But before they could take another step, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley behind them, sharp and unmistakable. Isla's heart leaped in her throat, her body stiffening. Caleb, she whispered, barely audible. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. He was close now, too close. The dread that had been growing since they saw him outside had now solidified into something tangible. He had followed them. No, he had been waiting for this. Waiting for her to falter, to make a mistake. They turned a sharp corner, hoping to lose him in a labyrinth of the city's back streets. But Caleb was always a step ahead. There was no escape. The man reached for Isla's wrist, pulling her forward with desperate urgency. But they didn't get far before a voice, low and cold, stopped them in their tracks. Running away, Caleb's voice floated through the darkness, smooth as silk, but laced with an undeniable threat. "You don't think I'd let you just slip away, do you?" Isla's pulse spiked. She could feel the weight of his presence behind them, could feel his eyes boring into her back, even without turning around. It was suffocating, like a shadow that consumed everything. The man beside her turned, his face hard, determined. "You can't have her, Caleb," he spat, his voice low and rough. "She won't become one of you." Caleb's laugh came next, sharp and mocking. It was the kind of laugh that made the hairs on the back of Isla's neck stand up. "She already is." Isla flinched at his words, her stomach twisting. The hunger flared again, stronger this time, louder, urging her to turn around and face him, to embrace what he was offering. The infection was close to the surface, and Caleb was making it harder to resist. She closed her eyes for a moment, pushing back against the wave of temptation. She could feel the hunger, feel the pull, but she refused to let it control her. She refused to become another one of Caleb's puppets. She opened her eyes and faced Caleb, her voice steady but firm. "You're wrong. I'm not like you. I will never be like you." Caleb's gaze flickered for a moment. Was it surprise? Annoyance? Whatever it was, it quickly shifted back into something dark, something predatory. "You think you're different, don't you?" His words were like poison. "But you're not. We're all the same. And you'll come to me, just like everyone else." The hunger rose again, louder this time. It was a sickening sensation, like her very body was betraying her. "Just give in," it whispered. "It will be easier. You'll be free." But Isla couldn't. Not now. Not like this. She stepped closer to the man, her grip tightening around the hilt of the small knife at her side. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She wasn't going to fight Caleb with the same twisted power he had. She wasn't going to let the infection be her weapon. Instead, she had to fight with what was left of herself. "You're wrong about me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with defiance. "I won't become like you. I won't be consumed by this." Caleb's eyes narrowed, the flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. "We'll see," he said quietly, his tone almost gentle. "You don't get to choose how this ends, Isla. You never did." Before Isla could react, Caleb took a step forward, his figure blurring in the dim light as though he was moving faster than she could track. The man beside her immediately stepped in front of her, knife drawn, ready to defend. But Caleb didn't attack. Instead, he raised a hand, and for a moment, everything felt still, frozen. "Do you feel it?" Caleb's voice was almost soothing now, as if he were speaking to her like a mentor, like someone offering a gift. "The power? It's right there just beneath your skin. It's already part of you." Isla's breath hitched in her throat as she felt it, that feeling, the gnawing, twisting sensation in her chest, spreading out to her limbs. Her body wanted it. She could feel the infection within her waking, alive and screaming for release. But she held on, digging deep into whatever was left of her willpower, refusing to let the hunger take control. "You can stop fighting it," Caleb continued, his voice insistent. "You don't have to be afraid. Let in Isla. Let it make you stronger." Isla's hand shook, the knife in her grip suddenly feeling like a fragile piece of metal in the face of his words. But she took a deep breath, staring into Caleb's eyes, trying to hold on to her identity, who she was. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not like you, and I never will be." Caleb stared at her, his smile fading into something cold, calculating. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then, with a quiet sigh, Caleb stepped back, slowly vanishing into the shadows. "You'll regret this, Isla." His voice echoed in the dark, distant but filled with certainty. "But by the time you do, it will be too late." Isla's heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The infection was still there, still lurking, but for now, she had won. She had made it through another moment. The man beside her let out a long, relieved breath, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay?" Isla nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. The hunger was still there, a constant reminder that she wasn't truly free. Caleb had left for now, but she knew he wouldn't stop. Not until he got what he wanted. Not until he had her. And the question gnawed at the edges of her mind. How long would she be able to fight? The cold night air felt suffocating, and Isla's body trembled slightly from the tension that had built up in her muscles. Caleb's departure didn't ease the fear that clung to her like a second skin. The hunger was still there, pressing against the walls of her mind, and the threat of Caleb's words lingered in the air like smoke. He had been right about one thing. She wasn't the same anymore. The man beside her didn't speak immediately, giving her the space she needed, but his hand remained gently on her arm, a silent reassurance. He knew the battle inside her wasn't over, that the infection was far from quelled, even if Caleb had retreated for the moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Isla spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's right about one thing. I can feel it more than ever now." Her voice broke, the weight of the confession settling heavily on her chest. "I can't ignore it. It's inside me. It's part of me." The man's grip on her arm tightened, and she looked up to meet his gaze. There was a hardness in his eyes, but beneath it, she saw something else, something warmer, more human. Understanding. "You're still you, Isla," he said, his voice steady and comforting. "The infection might be part of you, but it doesn't define you. You're more than that. You can control it." She shook her head, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in front of her. "I don't know if I can. Caleb's right. It's already too far in me. It's always there, waiting to take over." He stepped closer, placing his hands on her shoulders, his eyes filled with something like quiet determination. "You've resisted it this long. I believe you can keep fighting it. We can do this together, okay? You're not alone in this." Isla met his gaze and saw the sincerity in his eyes, but a flicker of doubt still lingered in her heart. She wasn't sure if she could keep resisting Caleb's offer, or if she would give in to the dark hunger that tore at her, waiting for the moment of weakness. The city was eerily silent as they stood there, the weight of their conversation pressing down on them. The streets were empty, but Isla knew that wouldn't last long. Caleb wouldn't give up so easily. He would keep hunting her, keep pushing her, until he broke her. "Where do we go from here?" Isla asked, her voice shaky. The man's gaze softened, and he nodded toward a narrow, dimly lit street ahead of them. "There's a safe house not far from here. We can regroup, rest for a while, and figure out our next move. But we have to stay ahead of him. He's not going to stop." Isla hesitated, feeling torn between the need to flee and the growing dread in her chest. The infection wanted her to go back to Caleb. It whispered in her ear, promising power, freedom, and end to the struggle. But Isla wasn't sure if that was the answer anymore. Every part of her rebelled against the thought of surrendering to it. But the temptation was always there, waiting for her to crack. The man turned toward the street, leading the way, and Isla followed, her steps heavy with the burden of the choice she had made, and the one she still had to make. The city was dark, the streets full of shadows, but they moved quickly, knowing that any delay could be disastrous. As they rounded another corner, Isla thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She froze, heart pounding, a figure in the distance. She couldn't make out the details, but she knew who it was before her mind even processed the image. "Caleb," she murmured, her voice a mix of dread and disbelief. "He's following us." The man immediately pulled her into a nearby doorway, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing closer. They pressed themselves against the wall, holding their breath. The figure drew nearer, and Isla's heart skipped a beat when she realized that Caleb was getting closer, too close. He was moving with a purpose, with a speed that almost seemed unnatural. The infection had clearly given him an edge, and Isla couldn't help but feel a rising panic. The man beside her gripped her wrist, his voice a low whisper. "We can't stay here. He's too close. If we don't move now, he'll corner us." Isla's mind raced, her body shaking with fear. She didn't want to run anymore. The very thought of Caleb finding them, of facing him, sent her into a spiral. But she knew they had no choice. If they didn't keep moving, they'd be trapped. "We'll take a detour through the back alleys," the man continued. "Stay close. Keep quiet. Don't let him see you." They slipped out of the doorway, moving swiftly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows. Isla's heart hammered in her chest as they navigated the winding, narrow alleys, their steps quick but careful. The sound of Caleb's footsteps grew fainter as they moved further away from him. But Isla couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the man stopped and pulled Isla into another hiding spot, his expression tense. He turned to her, his eyes filled with urgency. "We don't have much time. Caleb's close, and we're not far from the safe house. If we can just make it there, we'll be okay." Isla nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. They had to make it. They had to get to safety, even if she wasn't sure what would happen once they did. Caleb had made his intentions clear. He wasn't going to let her go. He wasn't going to give up until he had her body and soul. As they moved again, Isla felt the weight of the infection inside her, the hunger, the power, the pull. It was harder to ignore now, harder to fight back. But she pushed it aside for the moment, focusing on their goal, survival. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing: Caleb wouldn't win. Not without a fight. They reached the safe house within minutes, the door opening quickly to reveal a dark, quiet interior. The man ushered her inside, and they quickly shut the door behind them, breathing heavily from the effort of staying ahead of Caleb. Inside, a small group of survivors huddled in the dim light. They were exhausted, battered, but alive. Isla leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She was safe for now, but as she glanced out the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb was still out there, watching, waiting for his chance. And Isla knew, deep down, that the battle was far from over. The door of the safe house clicked shut behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down Isla's spine. She leaned against the wall, her breath still shallow from the escape. Her body felt both heavy and hollow, like she was caught between two worlds, the one she was desperately trying to hold on to, and the other that was inside her, pushing for dominance. The infection was louder here, pulsing beneath her skin, urging her to listen to Caleb, to give in. But she couldn't. Not yet. The man who had led her here moved swiftly across the room to check the window, his expression tense. The others in the room, half a dozen people, maybe more, watched them with wary eyes. Some looked beaten down by the world, others with haunted, hollow gazes, but they were survivors, and they knew the score. "Did you lose him?" One of the survivors, a tall woman with dark, hollow eyes, asked, her voice raw from exhaustion. The man who had been with Isla nodded once, though the unease in his posture gave him away. "For now," he replied, voice steady. "But he'll come for us. He won't stop, not until he gets what he wants." Isla felt her pulse quicken again, the fear swirling inside her, but she forced herself to push it down. "We can't keep running," she said, her voice strong despite the shaky hands at her sides. "We need to end this. Caleb, he's not going to stop. We'll just be playing this game of cat and mouse forever." A tense silence followed her words, the others exchanging uneasy glances. It wasn't just fear in their eyes, it was a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. They had been running for so long, surviving in the margins of the world, hiding from the infected, hiding from Caleb. And for the first time, Isla felt like they all understood exactly what she meant. There was no safe place to hide. Not anymore. The man beside her spoke up, his voice low. "What do you mean?" Isla met his gaze, determination starting to set into her bones despite the chaos inside her. I'm not running anymore. I'm going to confront Caleb. Face him head on. I can't keep fighting this forever. It's in me, and if I don't stop it now, it'll take me. A murmur of unease rippled through the room, and the tall woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. You can't be serious. Caleb is dangerous. We've seen what he does to people, what he turns them into. Isla nodded grimly. I know, but I can't let him control me. I'm not like the others he's turned. Not yet. And I'm not going to give in to the infection, either. I can't just let it swallow me whole. She met the man's eyes again, her voice quieter now. I need to finish this, before I lose myself. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over at the survivors, his eyes filled with doubt, frustration, and something that might have been fear. But there was also something else, something that felt like hope. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Isla nodded. It's the only way. There was a long pause, the weight of her words settling over the group. The room was heavy with tension, the air thick with unspoken doubts. But then, the tall woman spoke again, her voice softer, resigned. I won't pretend I understand why you'd want to go after Caleb, but I've seen people like him, and if you're determined to fight him, you'll need to be ready for anything. He doesn't play by the rules. She paused, her expression hardening. He'll tear you apart if you let him. I know, Isla replied quietly, but I have to try. I can't keep running, and I can't keep pretending like I'm not already one step away from being just like him. The survivors exchanged glances again, and finally, the man who had guided her here nodded. Then we're with you, he said. Whatever happens. Isla swallowed the lump in her throat, surprised by the unexpected support. But she couldn't let herself get too emotional. She needed to stay focused. We leave at dawn, she said, her voice firm. We don't have much time. Dawn came too soon, and the first light of morning barely broke through the grime-covered windows of the safe house before Isla was already gathering what little they had left. She moved with a sense of urgency, her eyes scanning the room as the survivors quietly prepared for the mission ahead. The tension was palpable, a heaviness that hung over everything, weighing them all down. Isla didn't have any illusions. She knew this could be a one-way trip. Confronting Caleb was dangerous. She had seen firsthand how quickly the infection could take hold, how it could twist someone into something unrecognizable. But if she was going to stop him, she couldn't hesitate. The man who had stuck by her side since the beginning approached her as she was lacing her boots, his voice low but urgent. You don't have to do this, you know. We can find another way. She paused, looking up at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear that she had been feeling all along. But it wasn't just fear. It was love, too. Love for her. And for a moment, it broke her heart to think of what might happen. But then, the infection stirred inside her again, rising like an unstoppable tide, demanding that she act. The hunger was relentless, clawing its way up her throat, a constant reminder that Caleb was out there, waiting for her. I have to, Isla said softly. I have to stop him before I lose myself, before I lose all of us. The man didn't reply, but he squeezed her shoulder before walking away, preparing himself for whatever was to come. The survivors gathered their weapons, and the group made their way into the cold morning air, their breath visible in the early dawn light. They moved in silence, the city still eerily quiet as they trekked toward the place Caleb had been holding for himself, the place where the infection had been spreading like wildfire. Isla felt the weight of each step. She knew the fight ahead of her wouldn't be easy, but she had made her choice, and she wasn't going to back down now. Caleb was coming for them, and she would be ready. She had to be. The group moved in tight formation, their footsteps muffled by the thick morning fog that had settled over the city streets. It felt surreal, like they were walking through a half-remembered dream, a city they once knew now twisted and darkened by the infection. Every corner felt like a potential ambush, every shadow hiding a threat. But the closer they got to Caleb's stronghold, the more the air seemed to thrum with the growing sense of inevitability. Isla kept her gaze forward, her mind sharp, focusing on the mission at hand. The hunger gnawed at her, but she refused to let it dictate her actions. She had a purpose. She couldn't afford to let Caleb's words, his tempting offers, distract her. Not now. The man at her side, the one who had stayed with her through all of this, kept close, his eyes scanning the surroundings. She could feel his presence, steady and reassuring, but even that couldn't quell the growing unease in her chest. They reached the outskirts of Caleb's territory by mid-morning. The buildings here were more decayed, abandoned, their facades cracked and peeling. Graffiti marred every surface, some of it unintelligible, others scrawled with symbols Isla recognized, warnings. The mark of those who had tried to resist Caleb's influence and failed. One of the survivors whispered a warning from behind her, his voice trembling. "We're close. He knows we're here." Isla turned to face him. "Then we don't waste any time." Her voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it, one that she hadn't heard in herself before. The infection inside her was louder now, thrumming through her veins with every step they took. The hunger was constant, a presence that lurked just beneath her skin. But she wasn't alone. She had a team, a group of people who believed in her. They believed she could win, even if it felt impossible. That thought kept her moving, kept her pushing forward. They approached the entrance to an old, crumbling warehouse, a place that looked abandoned. But Isla could feel the weight of Caleb's presence inside, like a dark cloud hanging over them. She knew he was watching, waiting for them. The silence around them grew thick and oppressive as they closed in on the building. "Stay close," the man beside Isla whispered, and she nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of the small knife she carried. It wasn't much, but was all she had. She wasn't foolish enough to think they'd be able to fight Caleb head-on with just a few blades and makeshift weapons. The infection gave him strength she couldn't match. But she had her mind, and she wasn't going to let him take that from her. They reached the entrance to the warehouse. A rusted metal door hung ajar, an eerie invitation. The man reached for the door slowly, pausing to glance at Isla, his face tense with both concern and determination. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. Isla nodded, taking a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." He pushed the door open, and they filed in, moving silently into the vast, dark interior. The place smelled of rot and decay, the air thick with dust. Broken crates and scattered debris littered the floor, casting strange shadows in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the ceiling. But Isla's eyes were fixed ahead. She could feel Caleb's presence growing stronger, the pull of the infection more pronounced as they moved deeper into the building. They reached the heart of the warehouse, and there he was. Caleb. He stood in the center of the room, his figure silhouetted against a distant flickering light, like some kind of twisted king in his domain. His pale eyes gleamed in the half-light, and his lips curled into that infuriatingly calm smile. Well, Caleb's voice drifted through the air, smooth and taunting, like he was speaking to an old friend. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Isla's heart raced, but she stepped forward, pushing aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't back down now, not after everything she had been through. "I'm here to end this, Caleb," she said, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "I'm not going to let you control me, or anyone else. Not anymore." Caleb's smile deepened, his eyes flicking over her with that predatory gleam. "You still don't understand, do you?" His tone was almost sympathetic, as if he were speaking to someone who just didn't quite get the point. "You are one of us. You've been marked Isla. You can fight it, but eventually it'll consume you. I know you can feel it. The hunger, the power. It's all inside you." Isla's breath hitched, the hunger rising in her chest again, louder than before. It was almost unbearable. She could feel it, the twisted urge to let go, to embrace the infection, to let Caleb's words become her truth. But she fought it. "No," she spat, her voice trembling with the effort of holding herself together. "I'm not like you. I won't let this define me." Caleb stepped closer, his footsteps eerily quiet on the cracked concrete floor. "You're already mine," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "You just don't know it yet. But you will. You will come to me, Isla. And when you do, you'll finally understand the freedom that comes with letting go." Isla's heart pounded, the infection clawing at the edges of her mind. It was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel herself slipping, but she gritted her teeth, holding on, refusing to let him win. The man beside her stepped forward then, his voice firm. "She's not yours, Caleb, and neither is anyone else you've twisted into this." Caleb glanced at him with a smirk. "You still don't get it, do you? They're already lost. They're mine, and Isla will be too, soon enough." Without warning, Caleb's figure blurred, moving faster than she could track. He was upon them in an instant, his hands gripping her wrist before she could react, his eyes flashing with malice. "You could have been powerful, Isla," he murmured, his grip tightening. "But now you're just another one of them. A failure." Isla felt the infection flood through her, her skin tingling with its presence. She could feel the weight of it, the power, the rush, and it was so tempting. Her body screamed for release, for the freedom Caleb promised. But she fought it, dug her nails into her palm, and focused on the reality in front of her. The man at her side lunged at Caleb, swinging his knife, but Caleb was faster, dodging effortlessly. It wasn't just the infection he controlled anymore, it was everything. But Isla wouldn't give up. She couldn't. With a strength born of desperation, she twisted her body, breaking free from Caleb's grip and driving her knife into his side. His reaction was instantaneous, a hiss of pain escaping him as his grip faltered. But Caleb only laughed. "Is that all?" he sneered, pushing her away effortlessly. Isla stumbled back, gasping for breath. She had to hold on. She had to finish this. But then, as Caleb stood before her, eyes narrowing in fury, she realized something. She was the one who still held the power. Isla's heart hammered in her chest, her grip tight on the knife as she stood between Caleb and the rest of her group. The hunger inside her pulsed like a living thing, urging her to give in, to join him. But she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for them. For every person Caleb had twisted, for every survivor who was clinging to a shred of hope. Caleb's smile faltered for the briefest moment, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the knife protruding from his side. The wound was shallow, but it was enough to leave a trickle of blood staining his shirt. His gaze shifted to Isla, then to the survivors behind her. "You really think you can stop me?" Caleb's voice was full of venom, but there was something in it that bordered on admiration, respect. "Maybe. You're nothing but a fleeting echo of what you once were. You're all broken toys, Isla, and once I'm done with you, you'll join the others. It's inevitable." Isla's hands trembled, but she refused to let him see her falter. She tightened her grip on the knife, her knuckles white, and forced herself to speak. "I'm not your toy, Caleb. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." With a furious snarl, Caleb moved again, faster than she could track, his hand reaching for her throat. He was too strong, too quick. But this time, she was ready. Before he could close the distance, the man at her side lunged, using his body to intercept Caleb's movement. Caleb snarled in frustration, but the distraction was enough. Isla had a split second to act. She didn't hesitate. She plunged the knife into his stomach again, deeper this time, twisting it. Caleb let out a sharp gasp, but it was too late. His grip loosened, and he staggered back with a look of disbelief in his eyes. "You should have joined me," he spat, his voice ragged, his skin paling with each passing second. But Isla knew it wasn't over yet. Caleb was still dangerous, even with the blood dripping from his wound, his eyes wild with rage. He wasn't the same man she'd once known. The infection had changed him, corrupted him, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. He raised his hand, summoning the infection with a sickening growl, but Isla felt the pull too. She could sense it, feel it crawling under her skin, urging her to give in, to let it take her completely. But this time, she wasn't weak. In that moment, she realized what she had to do. The infection wasn't just a force outside her, it was part of her too. She didn't have to fight it anymore. She had to control it, to turn its power into something of her own. With a scream that echoed through the warehouse, Isla thrust her hand forward, not with a knife, but with everything inside her, her fear, her rage, her desperation, her strength. She pulled the infection from the depths of herself, harnessing its energy and forcing it into Caleb. For a moment, there was nothing but a flash of light, a rush of power that felt like a storm surging through her. Caleb recoiled, his face contorted with disbelief as the infection he had so long controlled began to turn against him. His eyes widened, and he screamed as the very thing he had used to control others began to consume him instead. Isla collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath as the power ebbed away from her, leaving her shaking, exhausted, but triumphant. The room was silent, save for the faint crackling of Caleb's body as it convulsed, the infection finally consuming him from the inside out. The man who had been by her side rushed to her, kneeling beside her as she struggled to regain control of her body. The survivors, who had been holding their breath in the background, let out a collective sigh of relief. "It's over," the man whispered, his voice trembling. You over the ringing in her ears, but she managed a faint smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her vision blurred, and she felt herself sway on her knees, but the man held her steady, his hands gentle on her shoulders. She looked over at the others, worn, battle-scarred, but still standing. They had made it through this together. They had faced the infection, faced Caleb, and survived. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something, not the end. As Caleb's body began to wither away, his form twisting in unnatural ways, Isla knew one thing for sure. She had taken control of the infection. For the first time in a long while, she felt the hunger recede, its influence no longer overwhelming her. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but she had gained the power to resist it. And that, she realized, was the true victory. Hours later, the survivors gathered in the remains of the warehouse. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the shattered walls and debris. They had fought for so long, and now, as they sat in the quiet aftermath, there was a sense of peace, tentative, fragile, but real. The man who had been with Isla from the beginning stood beside her, his expression softer now. He had been her anchor, her strength when she thought she had none left. "You did it," he repeated, his voice quieter this time. Isla nodded slowly. She was still catching her breath, still recovering from the battle that had nearly consumed her, but the relief was starting to sink in. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," she replied. "We did this together." He smiled, a small, tired smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Isla allowed herself to feel something other than the weight of the fight. She had made it. They had made it. The infection that had plagued the world was far from over. There were still others out there, still people who needed help, who needed to be freed from the chains Caleb had wrapped around them. But for the first time in a long time, Isla felt like there was hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and together they could rebuild. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the cracked windows of the warehouse, Isla felt the weight of everything that had happened crash down on her. The victory over Caleb had been hard-won, and though she had quelled the immediate danger, the future stretched before them like a vast, uncertain horizon. The infection was still out there, still consuming the world around them, and there were many more survivors who had yet to be freed from its grasp. But for the first time in a long while, Isla allowed herself to breathe, to think beyond the fight, to think about what came next. The survivors had gathered in small groups throughout the warehouse, tending to wounds, checking their supplies, and sharing silent glances that spoke volumes. Some of them were already making plans, quietly speaking about the next steps, about rebuilding, about finding others who had survived. But Isla couldn't focus on that just yet. Not until she had a moment to herself. The man who had stood by her side, his name was Jackson, approached her again, his face a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. His dark eyes studied her, like he was trying to read her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Isla glanced up at him, her hand pressing against the cold, cracked concrete of the warehouse floor as she gathered her strength. She wasn't sure what she felt anymore. Relief, exhaustion, grief, hope. It was all jumbled together, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the same person who had stepped into this battle. "I will be," she answered softly, her voice rough from the fight. "I think I just need a little time to process everything." Jackson nodded, his face softening as he took a step closer. "We've all been through hell. Don't rush it." He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "You did it, Isla. You stopped him. You saved us all." The weight of his words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of everything she had done. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the air between them felt thick with something unspoken. The bond they had forged over the past weeks had been born from necessity, survival. But now, in the wake of it all, Isla could feel that something had changed between them. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly, her voice a little unsteady. Jackson didn't say anything for a moment, just reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder in a silent gesture of support. His warmth was grounding, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. A silence fell over them, comfortable but heavy, until Jackson spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I know we've all got a lot to figure out, but I want you to know, we're not just surviving anymore. We're living. You've shown us that." Isla swallowed hard, his words striking a chord deep within her. The weight of the infection had always been about survival. But now there was something different. Something she hadn't dared to dream of until now. "Living," she repeated softly, her voice almost a whisper. "It's strange, isn't it, to think about anything beyond the fight?" Jackson smiled faintly. "We've all had to survive for so long, but we're starting to realize that there's more to life than just existing. There's a chance for something better." Isla met his gaze, her chest tightening with a mixture of fear and hope. The world was broken, and they had no idea what came next. But maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something worth fighting for. "I don't know if we can rebuild it all," she said softly, "but we can try. We can try to make things better, for the people who are still out there, and for the ones who've been lost." Jackson nodded, his expression growing more serious. "We'll need to keep moving. There are others out there, people who still need help, people who've been caught in this madness. We can't just stop now." Isla stood, her legs shaky as she found her footing, but the moment she did, she felt a surge of determination flood her. "We won't stop. We'll find them. We'll help them. And we'll make sure that the infection doesn't take anyone else. Not if we can help it." Jackson stepped back, a small but genuine smile playing at the corners of his lips. "That's the spirit." Before Isla could respond, one of the other survivors, a woman named Claire, walked over, her face drawn with exhaustion. She had been one of the first to join their group, a skilled medic with a sharp mind and a kind heart. Claire had been a steady presence throughout all of it, and now her eyes were filled with something that resembled hope. "I think we got a plan," she said, glancing at the others as they gathered in the corner of the room, discussing their next moves. "It's not much, but it's a start." Isla turned to face her, feeling the stirrings of something unfamiliar, hope. "What's the plan?" Claire glanced back at the group, then lowered her voice. "We've got a map. There are a few places we've heard of, safe houses, communities that might still be intact. If we can get there, we can link up with other survivors. Maybe even start something more permanent. We can build a network, help more people." Isla felt a shiver of something, relief, maybe, or just the weight of the unknown. But whatever it was, she couldn't ignore the truth in Claire's words. A network, a place to rebuild, to grow. "That sounds like a good start," Isla said, her voice firm again. "We'll need to move fast, but we can do it. Together." Claire nodded, a glimmer of something akin to optimism in her eyes. "We'll gather supplies tonight, rest up, and then head out at dawn. If we're lucky, we'll reach one of the safe houses within a couple of days." Isla turned to look at Jackson again, her heart racing at the thought of the road ahead. The infection wasn't done with them, but they weren't done fighting either. There was still so much to do, so much that needed to be done. But she was no longer fighting alone. They were all in this together. "We'll do it," Isla said with finality. "We'll make it." Jackson gave her a steady look, his expression quiet but resolute. "We'll make it." And with that, they set to work, gathering supplies and preparing for the next leg of their journey. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, Isla felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The infection was still out there, still dangerous, but they weren't going to let it consume them. Not now. Not ever again. They would rebuild. They would live. And they would fight for the future, for each other. As the night settled over the warehouse, the air grew thick with the weight of anticipation. The survivors moved quietly, each person focused on preparing for the journey ahead. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the walls, and the rhythmic sound of packing echoed in the stillness. It felt like a rare moment of peace in a world that had known nothing but chaos. Isla sat with Jackson near the makeshift campfire, a map spread out before them. The fire crackled and popped, the warmth offering a small comfort in the cold, desolate world they now inhabited. Her fingers traced the routes marked on the map, roads that had once connected cities and towns, now forgotten and overtaken by the infection. But there were still some safe places, some whispers of communities that had survived, and that's where they would head next. Claire and a few others were tending to their weapons, making sure everything was in working order. Everyone was on edge, knowing that at any moment they might encounter more danger. The infection was relentless, and even though they had taken down Caleb, they knew the fight was far from over. "We're heading toward the coast," Isla said softly, her voice almost lost beneath the crackling of the fire. She looked up at Jackson, her eyes filled with determination, but also the weight of everything that had come before. "There's a group there. They've been sending out radio signals for weeks, asking for help. If they're still holding out, maybe we can join forces. Build something larger. Fight back." Jackson's gaze lingered on her, as if weighing her words. "I know," he said after a pause, his voice steady. "But we have to be careful. Caleb was just one piece of this puzzle. There's still a lot we don't know." Isla nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle over her like a heavy fog. Caleb was the face of the infection in their world, but there were others, other leaders who had likely risen to power in the chaos, some as ruthless and calculating as he had been. The infection spread far and wide, taking everything it touched, and Isla knew it wouldn't be enough to simply take down one figurehead. They needed more. A network. A community that could fight back. But that didn't stop the doubts from creeping in. What if the people on the coast weren't as welcoming as they thought? What if it was all a trap? It was hard to trust anyone these days. The infection had twisted people into monsters, both literally and metaphorically. "We'll be careful," Isla said, shaking off the uncertainty. "We've survived this long. We can make it." Jackson gave her a reassuring smile. "We've got each other. That's what matters." Isla couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of relief in that moment. With Jackson and the others by her side, the weight of the world didn't feel quite as heavy. They weren't just a group of survivors. They were family now. And that bond was stronger than anything Caleb had ever created. The following morning, they set out early, just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the broken city. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant rustling of wind and the occasional groan of a collapsing building. The world around them seemed to be in a state of slow decay, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Isla led the way, her map clutched tightly in her hands as they walked through the desolate streets. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the remnants of a civilization that had once thrived, now reduced to rubble. The silence was oppressive, but Isla had learned to live with it. She focused on the path ahead, trying not to think too much about what lay behind. Jackson stayed close, his eyes scanning their surroundings, ever vigilant. The rest of the group followed in a loose formation, each person taking turns keeping watch, their faces grim and determined. They all knew that they couldn't afford to relax, not even for a moment. After several hours of walking, they reached the outskirts of the city. The familiar urban sprawl gave way to more open land, where the infection had spread its tendrils, leaving behind fields of twisted, overgrown vegetation. The air felt heavy, and Isla could sense the unease in the group. They were venturing into unknown territory, and none of them knew exactly what to expect. As they pushed forward, the landscape around them seemed to shift. The infection was everywhere, twisted trees, warped plants, and strange, unnatural growths that crawled across the land. The world had been irreversibly altered, and Isla had a fleeting thought that this might be what Caleb had wanted all along, to reshape the world into something unrecognizable. A world of fear, of hunger, of mindless obedience. But Isla wouldn't let it be that way. She couldn't. Not after everything they had fought for. They walked for hours, only stopping briefly to rest and ration their supplies. The hunger gnawed at Isla's insides, but she pushed it down, focusing on the journey ahead. The infection still simmered within her, a constant presence, but now it was something she could control. It was no longer the driving force in her life. It was a part of her, yes, but she wasn't going to let it define her. By late afternoon, they had reached a small town, abandoned and desolate. The streets were eerily empty, and the buildings were in varying states of decay. It was hard to tell whether anyone had lived here recently, or if it had been claimed by the infection long ago. Isla signaled for the group to slow down as they entered the town. The silence was suffocating, the air thick with dust. It was as though the world had forgotten this place, as if it had been swallowed up by the same darkness that had taken the rest of the world. "Stay alert," Isla whispered to Jackson, who nodded in response. They moved cautiously through the town, the buildings looming over them like broken sentinels. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the world pressing down on them. Isla kept her hand on the knife at her side, ready for anything. But it wasn't long before they heard it. The faintest sound, a rustling, coming from one of the abandoned buildings. Isla motioned for the group to stop, her heart pounding. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder, closer. Something or someone was out there. "Stay low," Isla instructed, her voice barely a whisper. The group crouched down, their movements deliberate and silent as they advanced toward the source of the noise. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Isla saw it, a shadow moving across one of the building's windows. Her instincts kicked in, and she signaled for everyone to take cover. The rustling grew louder, more frantic. Something was coming, and it wasn't friendly. The group huddled behind the crumbling walls of the nearby building, their breath shallow, hearts racing. Isla's mind was on high alert, every instinct screaming that whatever was out, there wasn't going to be an easy fight. The rustling noises were now punctuated by scraping sounds, like something or someone was dragging across the broken pavement. "Everyone, stay down," Isla whispered, her voice steady but low. She glanced over her shoulder at Jackson, who gave her a sharp nod, signaling that he understood. The others, too, were poised, ready for whatever was coming. Isla's grip tightened around the knife at her side, her fingers brushing against the worn handle. The infection inside her twisted, restless, as though it were stirring at the scent of blood and fear. But she forced herself to push it back, to focus on the present. They couldn't afford distractions, not now. The rustling grew closer. The sound of dragging feet grew louder, more distinct. And then, A figure emerged from behind a collapsed car, stumbling forward with an unnatural gait. It was a man, his face covered in dirt and grime, his clothes torn and hanging off his body like rags. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and glazed over, empty of thought of humanity. A screamer. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, then shambled forward in their direction, oblivious to their presence, at least at first. Its movements were jerky, erratic, like a puppet on broken strings. But as it neared the building, it suddenly froze. Its head snapped to the side, as though sensing them. The group tensed, every muscle coiled for action. "Shit," Jackson muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Not just one. There are more of them. Isla's eyes darted across the town, scanning for movement. Sure enough, in the shadows of the buildings, she saw them. More figures, dragging themselves out from behind piles of debris, their eyes empty, their bodies contorted and twisted, as though the infection had slowly eaten away at their humanity. They weren't just infected. These were people who had lost all control, turned into mindless, violent husks, driven only by hunger. They weren't fast or coordinated like Caleb had been, but they were relentless. She turned to the others, giving them a brief, urgent glance. "We need to move. Now." Isla took a deep breath and stood, raising her knife in one swift motion, ready to fight. She had fought these things before, and though she knew how dangerous they could be, she wasn't about to let them take anyone else. The group moved quickly, their boots thudding softly against the concrete as they made their way to the next building. Jackson was the first to act, lunging forward with a quiet, lethal movement that sent a screamer to the ground with a quick slash to its throat. The others followed suit, each survivor moving with practiced precision as they cleared a path through the mob of infected. The air was thick with the stench of decay and sweat, the sound of slicing through flesh punctuating the silence of the town. Isla's knife moved in quick, fluid motions, cutting through the infected with a force she hadn't realized she still had in her. The infection within her pushed at the edges of her consciousness, urging her to give in, to let the hunger take over and end it all. But Isla gritted her teeth, holding it back. She would not let it control her. As they fought their way through, the group began to form a tight perimeter, pushing forward until they reached a building that looked less decayed than the others. It was smaller, more fortified, and there were signs of life, fresh footprints in the dust, and a faint flicker of light from the cracked windows. Isla signaled for the group to stop, her eyes scanning the area. The screamers were still coming, but they were a distance away now. They had a moment to breathe. "We need to check this building," Isla said, her voice low. "If there's someone inside, they might be able to help us. And if not, we'll make it our base for the night." Jackson nodded, his gaze focused on the building. "Let's move quickly. We don't know what we're walking into." The group moved stealthily toward the entrance, their footsteps muffled by the crumbling ground. Isla led the way, her senses heightened, every nerve on edge. They reached the door, which hung slightly ajar, and Isla hesitated for a moment, weighing the danger of entering a potential trap. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open just enough to slip through, her body tense and ready for anything. The interior was dim, the only light coming from a few scattered candles on the ground. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint sound of rustling echoed from the back of the room. "Hello," Isla called softly, her voice steady but cautious. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from the shadows at the back of the room, a voice answered, a hoarse, low whisper. "You shouldn't have come." The group froze, every muscle in their bodies tensing as they slowly turned toward the source of the voice. From the darkness emerged a figure, tall and gaunt, his face hidden beneath a hood, his eyes shining with an eerie glow. "I warned you," the man continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You're not the first to think they can escape, but there's no escaping what's coming." Isla's heart pounded in her chest, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew those words. She had heard them before. The infection. But there was something different about this man. Something darker. The figure took a step closer, his footsteps soft but deliberate. You've seen the infections work up close. But what you don't understand is that it's not just spreading. It's evolving. And there's no stopping it now. Isla felt the weight of his words settle over her like a dark cloud. She knew this wasn't just another infected survivor. This man had answers. But were they answers she wanted to hear? Isla's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped further into the dim light, his gaunt form like a specter in the shadows. She could feel the tension building in the room, thick and suffocating. Jackson, standing just behind her, shifted his stance, his hand resting on the handle of his weapon. The others, too, were poised, waiting for any sign of aggression. The man's eyes glinted under the hood, a strange mixture of intelligence and madness flickering behind them. His voice was cold, calculated, as he spoke again, his words sinking deep into Isla's mind. You think you can just survive, don't you? His tone was almost mocking. You think you've seen the worst of this infection, that you've beaten it. But what you don't know is that this isn't a disease. It's evolution. The word hung in the air, heavy with a twisted kind of finality. Isla's heart pounded harder as she exchanged a quick look with Jackson. He didn't have to say anything. His face mirrored her unease. This man wasn't just a survivor. He knew something they didn't, something dangerous. What do you mean? Isla asked, trying to steady her voice. She couldn't afford to show weakness now, not with this man standing before them. How is this? Evolution. The man chuckled, a low, rasping sound that sent a chill down her spine. He took another step closer, his movement unnaturally smooth, like he had all the time in the world. You don't get it, do you? The infection. It's adapting. It's not just turning people into monsters. It's transforming them. The infected, they're changing. Soon, they won't be just mindless things. They'll be smarter, stronger. They'll be the rulers of this world. Isla's gut twisted. Smart? Stronger? That didn't sound like anything they had encountered so far. The infected they had fought, those screamers, had been brutal, yes, but they were mindless. Slow. Weak. If they became more than that. The implications were horrifying. You're saying it's not just a virus? That the infection, it has a purpose. Jackson's voice was tight with suspicion, but the man simply smiled, the edges of his lips twitching upward in a way that made Isla's skin crawl. Purpose, the man repeated, his eyes flashing with something like glee. No, purpose implies control. This isn't about control. This is about survival. The strong adapt, evolve, and thrive. The weak, they're left behind. Do you understand? The infection. It's the next step. It's the new order. Isla's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his words. She thought of Caleb, his twisted zeal for survival, his desire to force others to bow to him. Was this what he had been working toward? A world ruled by the infected, a twisted new hierarchy where only the strongest would survive? Why are you telling us this? Isla asked, keeping her voice steady, though inside, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She needed more information. If this man had any answers, she had to get them. The man's grin widened, his teeth glinting in the dim light. Because you're too late. His voice lowered, turning ominous. You've already seen the first wave, the screamers, the mindless thralls, but the second wave is already here. It's spreading. You won't be able to outrun it. Isla's blood ran cold. The second wave? He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. They're already among you. People like me, with the next stage. I can feel it. This new power, this hunger for something more. The infection will only keep growing stronger. And you're just a relic of the past, fighting a war that's already been won. Isla's mind spun as the man's words echoed in her ears. Was he one of the infected? Had he somehow evolved with the infection? His eerie calm. The way he spoke with certainty, he didn't sound like someone who was losing himself to madness. He sounded like someone who had embraced it. a thought hit Isla like a bolt of lightning. Could this be what Caleb was trying to achieve? A world where the infected weren't just mindless monsters, but rulers, intelligent, calculating, and ruthless. And worse yet, had they already encountered one of the new evolved ones without even realizing it? She stepped back, her hand subtly inching closer to the knife at her side. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice sharp, her body tense for action. The man didn't seem to notice the change in her posture. He simply chuckled again, a sound that was too eerie to be anything but sinister. "Nothing, not yet. I'm just here to warn you, to let you know that the world you're fighting for, it's already gone. All you're doing now is buying time before you're wiped out." Jackson took a step forward, his face hard. "You don't know us very well. We don't just die. We fight." The man looked at him with something that could only be described as pity. "Fight? What good is fighting when the enemy has already won?" Isla didn't like the way the conversation was going. This man, whatever he was, had answers. But answers that weren't just disturbing, they were a threat. He wanted them to feel powerless, to give up, to surrender to whatever nightmare he was a part of. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "We're not done yet," Isla said firmly, stepping closer to him, her voice unwavering. "You think the infection is evolving? Maybe, but so are we. We've survived this long because we refuse to give up." The man's expression flickered just for a moment, as though something about her words stung him. But then he merely laughed, the sound hollow and devoid of any real mirth. To something almost bored. "I'm not here to argue with you. You'll see soon enough. The infection doesn't care about your fight. It will consume you all in the end. And when it does, I'll be waiting." With that, he turned and walked back into the shadows, his movements silent and eerie, leaving the group standing there, shaken and uncertain. Isla didn't dare relax, not even for a moment, as she listened to the sound of his retreating footsteps fade into the distance. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the man's words hung over them like a cloud, and the quiet in the room was suffocating. Jackson was the first to break the silence, his voice low but firm. "What now?" Isla turned to face him, her expression hard. "Now, we do what we always do. We keep moving. We find a way to stop whatever this is before it's too late." Her fingers tightened around the knife, and her eyes glinted with a fierce determination. This was far from over. The group didn't speak much after the man's cryptic warning. They had seen enough to know that they could no longer afford to let their guard down, not even for a second. Isla kept her focus on the present, the sharp reality of the world pressing against them from every side. They had no time to lose. If the infection was truly evolving, if the second wave was already among them, then they were in more danger than ever. As night fell, they made their way deeper into the abandoned town. The distant howls of the infected echoed on the wind, and Isla's heart pounded in her chest as they navigated through the ruins. Every shadow seemed to conceal something dangerous. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind was enough to make her jump. "We need to find shelter," Jackson said, his voice low and tense. "We need to regroup and figure out what to do next." Isla nodded. "There's an old church up ahead," she said, pointing toward a looming silhouette in the distance. "It looks intact. Maybe we can rest there for the night and plan." They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, staying as quiet as possible. They passed by destroyed storefronts, empty streets, and overgrown alleyways, each one filled with the remnants of what had once been a thriving community. Now, it was a graveyard of the past, a reminder of everything that had been lost. As they neared the church, a sense of unease settled in. The building loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. It had the look of a place long abandoned, yet there was a feeling of something off. Isla hesitated at the door, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something was wrong. "Stay alert," she whispered to the others. "Something doesn't feel right." The door creaked open, the sound too loud in the silence of the night. They filed inside cautiously, weapons drawn. The interior was dark, with only the faintest light filtering through. The broken stained glass windows. Dust hung in the air, and the air felt stale, as if the building hadn't seen life in years. They moved toward the center of the room, where a large wooden pew had been knocked over. And there, in the middle of the church, lay a figure in a emaciated, gaunt shape, its face half hidden in the shadows. The air in the church was thick, and as they approached, Isla realized that the figure wasn't alone. Behind it stood another, and then the realization hit her. These weren't just any infected. These were the evolved ones. The next stage. Isla's heart skipped a beat. They were surrounded. The man's warning echoed in Isla's mind as the evolved infected slowly turned to face them, their movements more deliberate and intelligent than any mindless thrall she had fought before. Their eyes were cold, calculating. They weren't just driven by hunger, they were aware, and they were ready to fight. Isla's instincts kicked in. She didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to hesitate. "Get ready," Isla shouted, but the words barely left her mouth before the first of them lunged forward. Jackson was the first to react. He swung his weapon with practiced precision, taking down one of the infected before it could get too close. The others followed suit, moving fast and fluidly, but it was clear that these evolved infected weren't like anything they had faced before. They were faster, stronger, and more coordinated. One of the infected, a tall, thin figure with a strange glow to its eyes, lunged at Claire, swiping its claws toward her throat. Claire barely dodged in time, but the infected strike ripped across her arm, sending a spray of blood into the air. "Claire!" Isla shouted, her heart hammering in her chest. She moved toward her, ready to defend, but another infected charged at her, its teeth snapping. Without thinking, Isla ducked, the creature's jaws missing her by inches. She drove her knife into its side, the blade sinking deep, but it didn't fall. It roared and shoved her back with unnatural strength. Pain flared in Isla's chest, and for a moment, everything went blurry. The infection within her stirred violently, pulling at her, demanding she give in. It felt like every muscle in her body was being dragged under the surface. But Isla refused to surrender. She gritted her teeth, forcing the infection back down. "Stay focused," she whispered to herself. The battle raged on, but the evolved infected were relentless. Every time one fell, another took its place. It was like they were hunting them, not just attacking mindlessly, but strategizing. Isla felt a sickening realization creeping over her. If this was what the infection had become, if the evolved were in control now, they were all in grave danger. They were being hunted. "We can't keep this up," Jackson shouted, his voice strained as he swung his weapon again. "We need to get out of here now." Isla nodded, her mind working quickly. "Fall back, to the door." They fought their way toward the exit, each of them battling their own infected adversary. The building was collapsing around them, debris falling from the ceiling as the church groaned under the strain. It felt as if the walls were closing in. Finally, they made it to the door. Jackson was the last to slip through, just as an infected lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. He barely avoided the strike, stumbling backward into the night. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. They were outside, panting, covered in blood, but alive. Isla's heart was racing, her body sore from the fight. But even in the chaos, she could hear the truth behind the man's words. The infection wasn't something they could fight off forever. It was evolving. And soon, it wouldn't be just the infected that they had to fear, it would be the very world itself. The night was quiet now, but the danger wasn't over. The infection, the evolved ones, had grown too powerful for any of them to face alone. They had fought as hard as they could, but Isla knew that the world they had once known was gone, and there was no going back. As dawn began to break, the survivors gathered in silence. They had no plan anymore, no next step. The world was too far gone. Isla stood alone at the edge of the ruined town, staring out at the horizon, the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. She could hear the faint echo of screams in the distance, and a sharp realization that the infection had truly taken over settled deep in her bones. "We fought," Isla whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "But we couldn't stop it." Jackson stood beside her, his face grim. "Maybe it was never about stopping it," he said softly. "Maybe it was just about surviving." Isla nodded slowly, her eyes clouded with the loss of everything they had fought for. The world was lost. The infection had won. For now. But they had survived. And that, in the end, was enough.